Hello friends, welcome to Dead Signal FM. Please, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. The first sound was like fingernails drawn across wet glass. A high, keening noise that seemed to hang in the stagnant air of the abandoned water treatment plant. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling against the curved concrete wall. I told myself it was just water dripping somewhere in the vast underground complex, echoing strangely through the network of chambers and channels. I shouldn't have been there at all. The lakeside water purification facility had been decommissioned 15 years ago when they built the new treatment plant upriver. This place had been left to decay, slowly surrendering to the surrounding forest and the constant seepage of groundwater. I'd grown up hearing stories about the place, how it was built in the 1940s, how 3 workers died during its construction when a retention wall collapsed, how the first superintendent hanged himself in the main filtration room after his wife and daughter drowned in the reservoir. But that wasn't why I'd come. I was here for the architecture, the industrial photography, that's what I told myself. Urbex, they call it. Urban exploration. Though there was nothing urban about this place. Standing alone in a clearing of birch trees 10 miles from the nearest paved road. The sound came again, longer this time, less like fingernails and more like something heavy being dragged across tile. It came from below, from the sublevels where the primary filtration system had once churned millions of gallons of lake water through massive concrete chambers. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice bounced back at me from a dozen different angles, distorted and unfamiliar. The facility had been easy enough to enter. A padlock rusted through, a chain that fell apart in my hands. Inside, the air was dense with moisture and the peculiar smell of standing water and concrete. Something mineral and ancient, like wet limestone in a cave. My boots left clear impressions in the fine silt that coated the floor of the entrance corridor. No one had been here in years, or so I thought. As I worked my way deeper into the complex, I noticed something odd. Small puddles of water dotted the floor at irregular intervals, like stepping stones leading me forward. The water was clear but had an iridescent sheen, rainbow colors shifting across the surface as I moved my light over them. When I knelt to examine one, I saw my reflection distorted, but there was something else there too. A flicker of movement that didn't match my own. I jerked back, heart pounding. Just a trick of the light. Had to be. The main control room was a cathedral of industrial decay. Massive switchboards covered the walls, their gauges shattered and dials frozen in time. A layer of condensation covered everything, beating on metal surfaces and dripping steadily onto the floor. The ceiling soared 30 feet above, punctuated by skylights now choked with vines and dead leaves. That's when I noticed the chair, a simple metal office chair, sitting perfectly centered in the middle of the vast room. Not toppled or shoved against a wall as you'd expect in an abandoned building, but placed deliberately, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing. The seat of the chair was bone dry despite the omnipresent moisture that slicked every other surface. And on the seat was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age but completely intact. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a technical diagram of the facility, the kind you'd find in an operations manual. But someone had modified it, adding strange symbols at certain junctions in the piping system. The symbols looked like letters from no alphabet I recognized, angular and wrong somehow, as if drawn by a hand that didn't quite understand how humans write. In the corner of the diagram, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "They're still in the filters. I can hear them breathing." A cold drop of water hit the back of my neck, making me gasp. I spun around, but there was only the empty control room, shadows shifting as my flashlight beam darted wildly about. Another drop hit my cheek, then another my forehead. I looked up. The ceiling 30 feet above was completely dry. I wiped my face, and my fingers came away slightly tacky, the liquid more viscous than water. It smelled faintly of copper. That's when the lights came on. Not all at once and not brightly, but throughout the facility, indicator lights on control panels began to glow with a dull reddish light, despite the fact that the power had been cut off for more than a decade. A low hum filled the air, building gradually in intensity, like massive machinery groaning back to life deep below. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Backup generators, solar panels I hadn't noticed, phosphorescent fungi, anything but what it felt like, that the facility itself was waking up around me. The diagram in my hand suddenly felt very important. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my pocket, then consulted my own map, a printout of the original facility plans I'd found in the county archives. According to this, there should be a stairwell in the northeast corner leading down to the primary filtration level. I found the door easily enough, a heavy metal thing with authorized personnel only stenciled across it in faded red letters. It opened with surprising ease, swinging inward to reveal a concrete stairwell spiraling down into darkness. The air rushing up from below was cold and carried that same mineral smell, only stronger now, with an undertone of something else, something organic and vaguely putrid. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to climb back up to the bright October afternoon waiting outside. But the photographer in me, the urban explorer, the fool who thought he was brave, that part of me began descending the stairs one careful step at a time. The stairwell corkscrewed down 6 flights before opening onto a long, tiled corridor. Unlike the upper level, this floor was completely flooded with about 2 inches of still, black water. My boots splashed as I stepped out of the stairwell, the sound impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The corridor stretched ahead of me, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Doors lined both sides, each marked with faded technical designations: primary sedimentation, flocculation chamber, chlorine contact basin. As I moved forward, I noticed my flashlight dimming, the beam growing weaker with each step. I shook it, slapped it against my palm, but the light continued to fade. Just as I was considering retreating to the stairs, I heard it. A voice, distant but distinct, echoing from somewhere up ahead. Cannot maintain surface tension at these levels. Molecular cohesion failing. It sounded like a man, his voice calm and clinical, as if dictating notes. But there was something profoundly wrong with the sound. It was both too clear and somehow liquid, as if the words were being formed by water itself. "Hello," I called again, my voice embarrassingly small in the vast underground space. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of dripping water remained. Then, from directly behind me, "You shouldn't be here." I whirled around, heart thundering in my chest, but the corridor behind me was empty. My flashlight flickered once, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, I fumbled for my phone, finally managing to activate its flashlight. The weak blue-white glow it cast seemed to be swallowed by the darkness rather than pushing it back. But it was enough to see that the water around my boots was no longer clear. It had taken on a reddish-brown tinge, thickening before my eyes. I sloshed forward, moving faster now, looking for another way out. According to my map, the corridor should eventually lead to a service elevator. If I could find that, maybe I could climb the shaft back to the surface. As I moved, I became aware of sounds coming from behind the doors I passed. Not mechanical sounds, but organic ones. Breathing, whispering. Once, what sounded like fingernails scraping desperately at the inside of a door as I passed. I walked faster, then broke into a jog, splashing through the darkening water. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before me, much longer than it appeared on my map. The doors began to change too, their designations replaced with strange symbols similar to those on the diagram I'd found, carved directly into the metal. Finally, I saw it, the elevator at the end of the corridor, its doors partially open, a sliver of darkness between them. I ran toward it, relief flooding through me. That relief evaporated as I drew closer and saw what was inside. The elevator car wasn't there, just an empty shaft, descending into blackness. But the narrow gap between the doors wasn't empty. Something was pushing through it. Something dark and glistening, squeezing itself through the impossibly narrow space with a wet, sucking sound. I backpedaled, nearly falling as my boots slipped in the water. I turned to run back the way I'd come, but froze at what I saw. The corridor behind me had changed. The doors were gone, replaced by large circular windows, like portholes on a ship, spaced at regular intervals along both walls. Behind each window was water. Not the clean, chlorinated blue of a swimming pool, but dark, murky water that seemed to absorb light. And in that water, pressed against the glass, were faces. Not human faces, not exactly. They had the basic features: eyes, nose, mouth. But they were wrong, distorted as if seen through a funhouse mirror or underwater. Their eyes were too large, their mouths too wide. They watched me with expressions of infinite sadness and hunger. As I stared in horror, one of them placed a hand against the glass. Long-fingered, webbed, the skin a pallid gray-green. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth like those of a deep-sea fish, too many and too sharp. It spoke, the sound somehow penetrating the glass. Surface tension. My paralysis broke. I ran, no longer caring which direction, just away from those windows, those faces. I splashed through water that now reached my ankles, thick and warm against my skin. My phone's flashlight cut unsteadily through the darkness, showing me glimpses of my surroundings. Walls that seemed to pulse subtly, floor tiles arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and contract strangely in that place. Eventually, I found myself in a vast circular chamber that I recognized from the facility plans as the main distribution hub. 6 massive pipes, each large enough to drive a car through, emerged from the walls and converged in the center of the room, where they plunged into a deep, circular pit. The pit was filled with churning, black water. Not the stagnant fluid I'd been wading through, but something alive with movement, swirling in patterns too regular to be natural. As I watched, transfixed, the surface began to rise, water climbing the concrete walls of the pit with purpose, defying gravity. A sound filled the chamber, the same keening noise I'd heard when I first entered the facility, but louder now, resolving itself into something almost like words. The swirling water took on shapes, tendrils rising from the surface, twisting in the air like questioning fingers. One of those tendrils stretched toward me, moving with deliberate slowness. I backed away, but found myself against the wall of the chamber. The tendril hovered before my face, then split into smaller filaments that began to form a shape in the air. A face composed entirely of water, held together by impossible surface tension. It was my face, but older, much older, the skin sagging, the eyes sunken and filled with a terrible knowledge. The watery lips moved, and this time I understood the words clearly. "You've been down here with us for 50 years. My mind reeled. A lie, a trick. I'd entered the facility less than 2 hours ago. I remembered the bright October day outside, the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots as I approached the building. Didn't I? Suddenly, I wasn't sure. I looked down at my hands, seeing them as if for the first time. They were pale, the skin wrinkled not from age but from prolonged exposure to water. My clothes, which I thought were simply wet from wading through the flooded corridors, were in fact rotting off my body in places, the fabric decayed and green with algae. "No," I whispered, my voice sounding foreign to my ears. "I just got here. Today." The water face before me smiled, an expression of terrible pity. "You say that every time you surface, every year on the anniversary." "Anniversary of what?" I demanded, though some part of me already knew the answer. "Of when you joined us. When you came to photograph the abandoned facility and found the door left open. When you descended the stairs and never returned to the surface. When the reservoir claimed you as it claimed all of us." Images flashed through my mind, memories, if that's what they were, falling into the pit before me, water filling my lungs, the strange peace that came after the panic. And then, existence but not life. Awareness spread through the water system, consciousness diluted but never quite dissolved. The water face dispersed, droplets falling back into the churning pit. But the voice continued, now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You forget each time. Piece by piece, you rebuild your old identity. Convince yourself you've just arrived. You wander the facility, leaving wet footprints that vanish behind you. Sometimes you find evidence of your previous passages. The diagram you yourself marked with symbols that describe water's memory, the chair you position in the control room as a message to yourself. I shook my head violently, denying it all. I reached into my pocket for the folded diagram, but found only sodden pulp that disintegrated at my touch. My camera, which should have been hanging around my neck, was gone. Had it ever been there? "This isn't real," I insisted. "I'm leaving now. I'm going back up the stairs and out into the sunlight." Even as I said it, I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. The chamber had no visible exits, just the 6 massive pipes and the pit of swirling water. I pressed my hands against the concrete wall, feeling for a door, an opening, anything. My fingers sank into the concrete as if it were soft clay. I jerked back with a cry, examining my fingertips. They were normal, or what I perceived as normal, but the wall retained the impression of my touch. 5 deep holes that slowly filled with seeping water. "The facility remembers you," the voice said, "as the water remembers, as we all remember, down here in the dark." The surface of the pit began to rise again, more rapidly now, the water climbing the walls and spreading across the floor toward me. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. As the flood reached my feet, I felt something grab my ankles, hands pulling from below. I screamed, but the sound was cut short as I lost my footing and plunged into water that was suddenly much deeper than it should have been. I was sinking, pulled down by unseen forces. Above me, the surface of the water receded, a diminishing circle of dark, refracted light. The rational part of my mind, the part still clinging to reality as I understood it, screamed that this was impossible. The pit couldn't be this deep. I couldn't still be breathing underwater. This had to be a hallucination, a dream, a psychotic break. But as I sank deeper, that rational voice grew fainter. Around me, I began to make out shapes in the murky water, human forms, dozens of them, floating at different depths. They were naked and pale, their skin taking on the translucent quality of creatures that live their entire lives without sunlight. They turned as I passed, watching me with eyes that had long ago adapted to the darkness. Some I recognized from the portholes earlier. Others were new to me. Men and women of various ages, their clothes long since rotted away, their hair floating around their heads like dark halos. One of them approached me. A woman, her movements graceful and unhurried in the water. As she drew closer, I saw her face clearly. She was beautiful in a haunting way, her features delicate but her eyes ancient. She reached out and touched my cheek with fingers that felt like cold silk. "Another cycle complete," she said, her voice perfectly clear despite the water. "How much did you remember this time?" Before I could answer, memories began flooding back. Not just of my arrival today, but of countless other cycles. Years of surfacing, forgetting, wandering the facility, and eventually being pulled back down. Years of existing as both water and flesh, my consciousness spreading through pipes and filters during the long dark periods, then reconstituting itself into human form when the anniversary came around. I remembered the woman before me, Catherine, the superintendent's wife. I remembered them all, the workers who died during construction, the superintendent himself, and others who came later. Inspectors, maintenance workers, urban explorers, even a few local teenagers who broke in on a dare and never emerged. All of us trapped in an endless cycle, bound to the water and the facility that had claimed us. "Not much," I finally answered her. "Less than last time." She nodded sadly. "It gets harder. The human parts fade. Soon you'll be like the oldest ones, just currents and memory." I looked past her to where the dark water faded into absolute blackness, a depth that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the facility. Something moved in that darkness, something vast and amorphous. Not human, not even once human, but something that had always been here, in the deepest water, waiting. "What is that?" I asked, though I'd asked before many times. Catherine turned to look. "That's what called us all here, what keeps us here, what we're becoming, piece by piece." As if in response, a deep vibration passed through the water, a sound felt rather than heard. The human shapes around us shuddered at its passing, their forms momentarily losing cohesion, becoming briefly one with the water before reforming. I felt it too, the pull to let go completely, to surrender what remained of my humanity and disperse into the endless dark water. How much easier it would be than this half-existence, these cycles of remembering and forgetting. But something held me back. The same thing that drove me to surface each year, to reconstruct a human form and identity, to climb back up into the facility proper and pretend I just arrived. Hope, maybe, or simple human stubbornness. "I'm leaving," I said suddenly. "This time, I'm really leaving." Catherine's expression didn't change. She'd heard this before too. "Then we'll see you next cycle," she said, already beginning to drift away from me, dissolving slowly at the edges. I turned and began to swim upward, toward the distant surface. The other shapes made no move to stop me. They didn't need to. The facility itself would keep me contained, as it always had. As I neared the surface, the water around me grew lighter, clearer. I could see the concrete rim of the pit above. With a final effort, I broke through, gasping for air I didn't actually need. The chamber was exactly as I'd left it, but the water level had receded back to the pit. I pulled myself out, my clothes inexplicably dry, my body feeling solid and real again. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, my voice echoing in the empty chamber. "I am walking out of here right now." And amazingly, a door appeared in the wall. A simple metal door with a push bar, exactly where there had been only solid concrete before. I approached it cautiously, expecting it to disappear or transform into something monstrous. But it remained solid and real under my touch. Pushed it open. Beyond was a concrete stairwell spiraling upward. Hope surged through me as I began to climb, taking the steps two at a time. Light filtered down from above. Real daylight, golden and warm. I climbed faster, my heart pounding with excitement rather than fear. After what seemed like an eternity of climbing, I reached the top. Another door, this one metal and rusted, with a flaking red exit sign above it. I crashed through it and emerged into the main control room, the same control room I'd entered hours ago, with its massive switchboards and high ceiling. The metal chair still sat in the center, but the diagram was gone. In its place was a small puddle of water. Something moved at the corner of my vision. I turned slowly to see a young man standing by one of the switchboards, examining it with interest. He wore hiking boots, cargo pants, and a flannel shirt. A camera hung around his neck. He looked exactly like I remembered looking when I arrived here today. He hadn't noticed me yet. I took a step toward him, my foot splashing slightly in a puddle I hadn't seen. At the sound, he turned, startled. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing just as mine had. "Is someone there?" I opened my mouth to warn him, to tell him to leave immediately, to run as fast as he could back to the surface and never return. But what emerged was something else entirely. "Cannot maintain surface tension at these levels. Molecular cohesion failing." The words weren't mine. The voice wasn't mine. But the horror dawning on his face was exactly what I'd felt earlier, when I'd heard those same words echoing through the flooded corridor. I tried again to speak, to warn him. Instead, I felt myself changing, losing solidity. My vision fractured, as if I were seeing through compound eyes or multiple perspectives simultaneously. I was in the control room, but also in the pipes, the filters, the stagnant puddles on the floor. The last thing I saw clearly was the young man, myself, backing away in terror, then turning to flee deeper into the facility, exactly as I had done. Exactly as I always did. Then I was everywhere and nowhere, dispersed through the water system, my consciousness diluted but aware. I felt the others around me. Catherine, the superintendent, all the souls the facility had claimed over the decades. And below us, in the deepest water, the ancient presence that had always been here, patiently absorbing us, one by one. I would reform eventually when the cycle came around again. I would forget and wander and remember and return to the water, as I always had, as I always would. In a distant part of the facility, I felt the vibration of footsteps as the young man, my newest iteration, made his way toward the stairwell that led down. I tried to surge through the pipes to intercept him, to somehow prevent what was coming. But the water only whispered what water always whispers: surface tension, molecular cohesion, the inevitable pull toward the depths. And somewhere in the darkness, something ancient and patient waited, as it had always waited, for us all to join it beneath the surface. The first thing I noticed was wrong about the abandoned water treatment plant was the humming. Not mechanical, that would have made sense. This was melodic, almost tuneful, rising from somewhere deep beneath the crumbling concrete floors. It wasn't constant either. It came in pulses, like breathing, with stretches of silence that somehow felt even more threatening than the sound itself. I'd been documenting forgotten industrial sites across the Midwest for nearly 3 years, but I'd never encountered anything like this place. The Millerton Water Authority had ceased operations in 1976 after a contamination scandal. Something about high levels of mercury that officials claimed came from natural deposits but locals swore was industrial waste. Whatever the truth, the facility had been hastily abandoned, equipment left to rust, and documentation sealed by court order. That should have been my first warning. Places with sealed records always have stories. The late October air bit through my jacket as I forced open the rusted service door, my camera bag catching on a twisted piece of metal. The facility sprawled across 5 acres of overgrown land, partially sunken into the earth like it was being reclaimed. Most urban explorers focused on the main filtration building with its massive turbines, but I was interested in the underground cisterns, massive concrete chambers that once held millions of gallons of drinking water. The humming stopped the moment I stepped inside. The main corridor stretched before me, emergency lights long dead, daylight barely penetrating beyond the first 20 feet. My headlamp cut through darkness thick as oil. The beam revealed walls covered in black algae, growing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I touched one patch and pulled back instantly. It was warm and slightly pulsing. I told myself it was just the cold making my fingers sensitive. The descent into the lower levels came quicker than expected. A metal staircase, surprisingly intact, spiraled down 6 stories. Each step echoed no matter how lightly I placed my feet, the sound distorting as it traveled through the facility. By the 3rd level down, the echoes seemed to return slightly altered, as if something was adding subtle variations to the sound. I paused, listening. The silence felt wrong, like someone holding their breath. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice returned to me in fragments, disjointed syllables that didn't quite match what I'd said. I strained to hear, wondering if the acoustics were playing tricks. "Not alone here." The whispered response froze me in place. It wasn't an echo. It was too clear, too deliberate, like someone standing just behind me, lips nearly touching my ear. I spun around, nearly dropping my camera. The stairwell was empty, but the air had become noticeably colder, my breath suddenly visible. I should have left. A reasonable person would have left. But the historian in me, the documenter, needed to understand. I'd explored dozens of abandoned places. I knew how the mind could create phantoms from drafts and settling structures. I convinced myself it was just unusual acoustics or perhaps another explorer playing a prank. I continued downward. The bottom level opened into a round antechamber lined with control panels and gauge displays. Thick glass windows looked out into darkness, the main cistern. According to my research, it was a perfect circular chamber nearly 60 feet in diameter, designed to hold the purified water before distribution. I found the control panel still had a functional emergency spotlight. When I flipped the switch, a weak yellow beam cut through the window, illuminating perhaps a third of the cistern beyond. The floor was dry concrete, crisscrossed with cracks that formed odd geometric patterns. But what caught my attention was the collection of objects arranged precisely in the center of the visible space. Small personal items that seemed completely out of place. A single child's shoe, a tarnished compact mirror, what looked like a small notebook with a leather cover, and most disturbingly, a collection of old photographs arranged in a perfect circle. My throat tightened. I hadn't been the first one here in years. Someone or something had been arranging these things. Recently, the humming started again, louder now, seeming to vibrate through the concrete beneath my feet. It had a rhythm that seemed almost like words. If I could just make them out, I pressed my ear against the glass. Coming home, remember coming home. I jolted back. The voice was clearer now, neither male nor female, but somehow familiar, as if I'd heard it in a dream. I felt lightheaded, disoriented. Something was wrong with the air down here. I needed to get the shots I came for and leave. I found the heavy circular door leading into the cistern itself. It opened with surprising ease, as if recently used. The air beyond was different. Colder, yes, but also heavier, with a mineral smell that burned my nostrils. My headlamp seemed to dim the moment I stepped inside, the beam absorbed by the darkness rather than cutting through it. The arrangement of objects was even more disturbing up close. The photographs were face down except for one. I knelt to examine it, my fingers trembling slightly in the cold. It was a family portrait from what looked like the early 1970s. A smiling couple with a young boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. They stood in front of a house I'd never seen before, but something about the boy's smile made my stomach lurch. I flipped over another photograph. The same family, but now just the woman and the boy, both with solemn expressions. Another photo. The boy alone, older now, perhaps 10. My breath caught in my throat. There was something about his eyes, the shape of his face. I dropped the photo as if burned. Couldn't be. It was impossible. But the resemblance was undeniable. The boy looked exactly like my childhood photos. Same cowlick in the hair, same slightly crooked smile. But I grew up 300 miles from here with parents who were still alive. This couldn't be me. The humming grew louder, resolving into a distinct melody now, a lullaby my mother used to sing, the one she claimed her grandmother had taught her. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The air in front of me condensed, moisture gathering into a fine mist that hung motionless for a moment before starting to swirl. It formed and reformed, never quite taking a solid shape but suggesting a human figure. The temperature plummeted, my breath coming in visible clouds that joined the mist, becoming part of it. From the mist, words formed. Not spoken aloud, but somehow transmitted directly into my mind. "You don't remember this place, but I do." The mist drifted closer, and I could smell something beneath the mineral dampness. A faint, sickly sweet odor like rotting flowers. I backed away, bumping into something solid behind me. I turned to find the doorway had vanished, replaced by smooth concrete as if it had never existed. My headlamp flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight with shaking fingers. The weak blue-white light barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. The mist was gone, but the objects remained. And now, the photographs had all turned face up, arranged in a timeline. The boy growing older in each image, through his teens into early adulthood. And in each photo, he looked more and more like me, until the final photograph, which was unmistakably me, standing in front of my current apartment building. A photo I had never taken. My knees gave out. I collapsed onto the cold concrete, my mind racing to find some explanation. A prank? An elaborate setup? Had I been drugged? The humming stopped, replaced by a sound like water rushing through pipes long dormant. The concrete floor beneath me began to vibrate, and then to my horror, water started seeping up through the cracks in the floor. Not clean water. It was black and viscous, with that same sickly sweet smell, now stronger. I scrambled to my feet, splashing through the rising liquid as I searched desperately for the vanished door. The water climbed past my ankles, burning cold against my skin. My phone's light revealed nothing but smooth concrete walls in every direction. Then my light caught something moving in the liquid, dark shapes swimming just beneath the surface. I raised the light, and the beam reflected off dozens of eyes watching me from the water. Eyes that submerged when the light touched them. A splash behind me. I spun around. Nothing visible, but the water was rising faster now, nearly to my knees. And then I felt something fingers cold and slick, wrapping around my ankle. I kicked violently, breaking free, only to feel more hands grabbing at my legs from below. Panic overtook me. I thrashed through the water, no longer caring about direction, just trying to escape those grasping fingers. My phone slipped from my grasp, its light disappearing beneath the black surface, leaving me in total darkness. And then, a voice, clear as day, directly beside me. "Don't you remember drowning here, Michael?" It was my name, my actual name, and the voice, I recognized it now. It was my own voice. "I've never been here before," I gasped, water now up to my waist. "I grew up in Lansing. My parents are David and Mary Kessler." Laughter echoed through the chamber, bouncing off walls I could no longer see. "Those aren't your parents. They found you wandering on the highway. No memory. Just a scared little boy who couldn't remember watching his real mother drown in the contaminated water. Couldn't remember how the men in suits said it was an accident. Couldn't remember being taken away to forget it all." The water reached my chest, and with it came flashes. Vivid, painful images burning through my mind. A woman's face, contorted in fear, sinking beneath black water. Men in hazmat suits, documents being signed. My small hand in the grip of a social worker. "No," I whispered. "That's not true." But even as I denied it, something buried deep inside recognized the truth. The frequent nightmares of drowning. My inexplicable fear of dark water. The 3-month gap in my childhood memories that doctors had attributed to trauma from a car accident I'd never quite believed in. The water reached my chin. The hands from below had stopped grabbing, but now they were pushing, keeping me from finding higher ground, guiding me to the center of the chamber. They buried the truth about what happened here. They buried the contamination. They buried the deaths. But some things can't stay buried. Some memories need to be remembered. My feet lost contact with the floor. I was floating now, struggling to keep my face above the rising water. The surface had become a perfect mirror, and in it, I could see not my own reflection but the face of the boy from the photographs. My face, but younger, eyes wide with the same terror I felt now. "You came back. You always come back. Every 5 years, like clockwork, drawn by what you can't remember. And every time you forget again. But I never forget. I'll never let you forget again." The water touched my bottom lip. I tasted chemicals, felt the burning sensation as it entered my mouth. My limbs were growing numb, whether from cold or something in the water I couldn't tell. "Please," I begged, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. "I don't understand." "You will. Just let go. Let the water take you down. See what's been waiting." I had seconds left. The water rose inexorably. With my last breath, I asked, "Who are you?" The answer came as the water closed over my face. "I'm what you left behind. I'm what you could have been. I'm the truth they drowned." Darkness enveloped me completely as I sank. But instead of suffocation, I experienced perfect clarity. Memories rushed back, not just fragments but complete scenes. My real mother's face, the water treatment plant where she had worked, her discovery of falsified safety reports, the accident that silenced her, the officials who had separated me from my past. I should have been terrified, should have been fighting for air. Instead, a strange calm overtook me. The water felt like it was dissolving more than my consciousness. It was dissolving time itself, erasing the artificial boundaries between then and now. Through the black water, I saw a light below, a pale blue glow emanating from the very bottom of the cistern. As I drifted toward it, I realized it wasn't a light at all, but an opening, a hole in reality itself, leading somewhere else. And then, impossibly, I heard knocking, distant at first, then louder. A voice calling my name, my current name, not the one from before. The water began to recede, draining rapidly through the cracks in the floor. My lungs burned as air rushed back in. I gasped, coughing violently, expelling black liquid onto the now dry concrete floor. The cistern was empty again, the only moisture the puddle beneath my drenched body. "Michael, are you in there?" The voice was real, coming from beyond the wall where the door had been. A flashlight beam cut through a crack. The door was back, being forced open from the outside. My colleague James appeared, looking concerned. "Jesus, man, you've been in here for hours. Wasn't answering your phone. Your car's still outside." I stared at him, disoriented. "Hours? I just got here." James helped me to my feet, his expression puzzled. "You're soaking wet. Did one of the pipes burst? And why are you sitting in the dark?" I looked down at myself. My clothes were indeed soaked, but with clear water, not the black liquid I remembered. My phone was in my pocket, undamaged. My camera bag sat neatly beside the wall, untouched. I must have slipped, hit my head. The lie came automatically, though I had no memory of deciding to lie. James nodded, unconvinced but not pushing. "Let's get you out of here. This place gives me the creeps anyway." As he led me toward the door, I glanced back one last time. The floor was empty, no photographs, no arranged objects. Nothing to suggest anything unusual had happened. But in the corner of the room, a small puddle of water remained. As I watched, it moved, flowing against gravity up the wall, forming characters that could only be seen from where I stood. 5 years. Then it collapsed, splashing back to the floor as ordinary water. I let James guide me up the stairs, through the corridors, back into the daylight. I nodded at his concerned questions, accepted his offer of a ride home since I was clearly in no shape to drive. I played the role of someone who had experienced a minor accident, nothing more. But as we drove away, I caught sight of my reflection in the side mirror. For just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it. My face rippled like disturbed water, revealing the face of a young boy beneath my adult features. A boy whose eyes held decades of patient waiting. 5 years. It would be waiting for me, and somehow, I knew I would return, drawn back by memories I wouldn't remember forgetting. I checked the date on my phone, making a mental note. October 17th. 5 years from today. I'm already counting down the days. It started with a single pebble. I was sitting at the rickety desk in my newly rented fire lookout tower, staring through rain-streaked windows at the endless green canopy of pine trees. 3 weeks into my writer's retreat, and the isolation was exactly what I'd hoped for. Miles from civilization, perched 50 feet above the forest floor in this abandoned sentinel from another era. The tower had been decommissioned decades ago, then converted into a rustic rental for the ultimate wilderness experience. No electricity except what my solar generator could provide. No running water beyond the rainwater collection system. No cell service.
No neighbors.
Just me, the manuscript I couldn't seem to finish, and the incessant Oregon rain drumming against the weathered glass. That's when I heard it. A small, distinct click behind me. I turned to see a pebble lying in the center of the room, glossy and black, wet as if it had just been plucked from the creek 200 yards downhill. I frowned, picking it up. It was freezing cold against my fingertips, much colder than the ambient temperature of the tower. I hadn't brought rocks inside. The windows were sealed against the persistent drizzle. The trapdoor that served as the only entrance remained firmly closed. I set the stone on my desk and returned to work, dismissing it as something I'd somehow tracked in days earlier without noticing. But as twilight gathered like a bruise against the panoramic windows, I found myself staring at that small black stone rather than my laptop screen, unable to shake the certainty that it hadn't been there before. That night, I dreamed of pebbles raining from the ceiling. The next morning, I awoke to whispers, not the wind through pine boughs or the gentle patter of rain. These were hushed, urgent murmurings just below the threshold of comprehension. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering as I scanned the hexagonal room. The whispers stopped immediately. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish. The trapdoor remained locked from the inside, just as I'd left it. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting honeyed light across the worn floorboards. Everything looked normal. The small kitchenette with its propane stove, the desk with my laptop, the camp toilet behind its privacy screen. the shelves containing my meager supplies, and on the floor, a perfect circle of 17 black pebbles surrounding my sleeping bag. I scrambled to my feet, dislodging several stones with my sudden movement. This wasn't possible. I'd swept the floor before going to bed, a nightly ritual to clear my mind before sleep. And even if I'd somehow missed these stones, how could they have arranged themselves in such a deliberate pattern while I slept? I gathered the pebbles in my trembling hands. Each one was identical to the first, smooth, black, and unnaturally cold. I hurled them through the trapdoor, down the stairs, watching them bounce and clatter into the underbrush below. When I turned back, there was a single pebble sitting on my pillow. I decided I needed fresh air, exercise, something to clear my head. I'd been alone too long with nothing but my thoughts and my struggling manuscript about, ironically, a man losing his grip on reality. The isolation was getting to me, that was all. The forest trail calmed me. I hiked for hours, breathing in the petrichor and pine, feeling my anxiety dissolve with each step. I took photographs of nurse logs sprouting new saplings, of mushrooms clustering along rotting trunks, of sunlight dappling through the emerald canopy. By the time I began my ascent back to the fire tower, I was convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, or perhaps played a trick on myself in my sleep-deprived state. I was halfway up the wooden staircase that spiraled around the tower's exterior when I heard my name. Daniel! It wasn't shouted. It was whispered, but with such clarity that it seemed to come from just behind my right ear. I spun around so quickly I nearly lost my footing, clutching the weathered railing as I stared down at the empty staircase below. "Hello," I called. "Is someone there?" Only the soft sighing of wind through trees answered me. I continued climbing, faster now, the hairs on my arms standing at attention. As I neared the top, a fluttering movement caught my eye. Something was hanging from the railing just above me. It was my notebook, the leather-bound journal where I kept my most personal thoughts and story ideas. But I'd left it locked in the drawer of my desk. I was certain of it. I snatched it from the railing and flipped it open. Most pages were as I'd left them, covered in my cramped handwriting. But the final page, which I knew had been blank, now contained a single sentence written in what appeared to be my own handwriting. "You're not alone up here, Daniel." I slammed the notebook shut, my pulse a drummer gone wild in my chest. This was impossible. I unlocked the trapdoor with shaking hands and climbed inside, half expecting to find an intruder, some forest vagrant who'd been playing elaborate tricks on me. The tower was empty, but something was different. Every pebble I'd thrown away was back, arranged in a perfect line leading from the trapdoor to my desk. And sitting in my chair, facing away from me, was the distinct silhouette of a person. I froze, unable to speak, to move, to breathe. Then the chair swiveled slowly toward me, empty. But as it turned, something rolled off the seat and clattered to the floor. A small tape recorder. It clicked on by itself, emitting a burst of static followed by a whisper. "Welcome home, Daniel. I should have left then." Any rational person would have packed their things and fled down the mountain, writer's retreat be damned. But I've never claimed to be entirely rational, especially when it comes to my work. Some insidious part of me, the writer part, was already cataloging these events, wondering how to weave them into my struggling manuscript. Besides, I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps another hiker was playing an elaborate prank. Or maybe the previous occupant had left the tape recorder as a joke for the next guest. I examined the device carefully. It was old, the kind with physical buttons and a cassette compartment. I popped it open, but there was no tape inside. I pressed rewind, play, fast forward, nothing happened. The batteries were dead. I set it aside and began methodically searching the tower, looking for signs of intrusion or tampering. The windows were still sealed. The trapdoor had been locked from the inside. There was simply no way anyone could have entered. As darkness fell, I sat at my desk, attempting to work on my manuscript. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself writing detailed accounts of the strange occurrences, the pebbles, the whispers, the notebook, the tape recorder. If nothing else, they might serve as material for a future story. At some point, I must have dozed off. I awakened with a start to complete darkness. The solar-powered lantern I'd left on was now off. The temperature inside the tower had dropped precipitously. I could see my breath clouding in front of my face, and someone was breathing behind me, heavy, labored breaths, the wet sound of lungs struggling for air. I could feel the cold exhalations on the back of my neck. I sat rigid, afraid to turn around. My hand inched toward my phone, though I knew it was useless as anything other than a flashlight this far from civilization. The breathing grew closer, louder. With a surge of desperate courage, I spun around, simultaneously activating my phone's flashlight. Nothing was there, but the light revealed something else. On the window behind me, frost was forming. Not the delicate patterns of natural ice crystals, but deliberate strokes, as if drawn by an invisible finger. You took my place. I staggered back, knocking over my chair. The frost message began to melt immediately, water trickling down the glass like tears. I rushed to the other windows. Each bore a similar message melting before my eyes. Not your tower. Still on duty. Watching for fire. My breath came in short, painful gasps as I struggled to process what I was seeing. The messages had appeared simultaneously on different windows. No single prankster could manage that. I fumbled for my laptop, desperate for light, for connection, for anything that tethered me to the rational world. As the screen illuminated, I saw a document open that I hadn't created. A scan of an old newspaper article. Lookout found dead after lightning strike. August 12, 1967. Martin Caldwell, 34, was discovered deceased in the Ravenwood Fire Lookout Tower following a severe electrical storm. Investigation suggests Caldwell was killed instantly when lightning struck the tower. Forest Service officials note that despite explicit evacuation orders due to the approaching storm, Caldwell refused to abandon his post, citing his duty to protect the forest. The Ravenwood Lookout will be decommissioned following this tragedy. My tower. This tower. The article included a grainy photograph of a stern-faced man standing proudly before the same hexagonal structure I now occupied. Martin Caldwell's eyes seemed to bore into me across the decades. A blinding flash of lightning suddenly illuminated the room, followed immediately by an ear-splitting crack of thunder. I hadn't even realized a storm was approaching. The laptop screen went black. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the windows in their frames. And in that moment, as another lightning bolt temporarily banished the darkness, I saw him. A man standing in the corner, his outline flickering and distorted like a bad television signal. His clothes were old-fashioned, his face partially obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to recognize him from the photograph. Martin Caldwell, the dead lookout. He raised a hand toward me, and every object in the room, my books, my supplies, my equipment, rose 6 inches into the air and hung there, suspended as if gravity had taken a holiday. Then, with a sudden violent motion of his arm, everything flew against the walls with explosive force. I dove to the floor as debris rained around me. When I dared to look up again, he was gone. Dawn found me huddled beneath my desk, surrounded by the wreckage of my belongings. I'd spent the night there, too terrified to move as the entity that had once been Martin Caldwell made its displeasure known. Objects had flown across the room. Invisible hands had pounded on the walls. That same wet, labored breathing had circled me for hours, sometimes whispering incoherent words directly into my ear. Morning light revealed the extent of the destruction. My clothes had been shredded. My food supplies were scattered across the floor. My laptop screen was cracked, though miraculously still functional. Most disturbing of all, every page of my manuscript, both digital and the hard copies I'd printed, had been altered. The text now contained a single phrase repeated thousands of times. My tower, my tower, my tower, my tower, my tower. I needed to leave. Now, I threw essential items into my backpack with trembling hands. I didn't bother with neatness or organization, just grab and go. Even in daylight, the tower felt wrong. The air too dense, the shadows too deep, the silence too complete. No birdsong penetrated the windows. No wind stirred the trees visible below. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I approached the trapdoor, hefting my backpack onto one shoulder. When I tried to pull the door open, it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, throwing my full weight against it. Nothing. It was as if it had been welded shut. "Please," I whispered, hearing the desperation in my voice. "I'll go. I'll leave your tower. Just let me out." Something scraped across the floor behind me. The sound of wood on wood. I turned to see my chair moving by itself, sliding across the room until it rested beside my desk. Then my laptop opened, the screen flickering to life despite the cracks spiderwebbing its surface. A blank document appeared, and words began typing themselves. "Too late, Daniel, the fire is coming, you must watch." "What fire?" I asked aloud, my voice cracking. "There's no fire." In answer, the temperature in the room soared. Within seconds, sweat poured down my face. The windows suddenly blackened, as if smoke had enveloped the tower. I rushed to them, trying to see outside, but they were completely opaque. The typing continued behind me. "My duty never ends, someone must watch, someone must warn, now it's your turn." I pounded on the windows, screaming for help that couldn't possibly hear me. The heat became unbearable, the air thick and difficult to breathe. I was suffocating, drowning in invisible smoke. In desperation, I grabbed my heavy flashlight and smashed it against the nearest window. The glass cracked but held. I struck again and again until finally it shattered. Cool air rushed in, sweet and pine-scented. The oppressive heat vanished immediately, and through the broken window, I could see that there was no fire, no smoke, just the peaceful forest stretching to the horizon under clear blue skies. Something clattered to the floor behind me. The trapdoor had unlocked itself and now stood open, offering escape. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my backpack and scrambled down the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, nearly falling in my haste. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead 2 miles away. I should have driven straight back to Portland. Should have forgotten about the tower, the pebbles, Martin Caldwell. Should have dismissed it all as hallucination, as stress, as anything but real. Instead, I found myself pulling into the small ranger station at the park entrance. I had to know if what I'd seen was true. The Caldwell had really died there. If the tower had really been decommissioned after his death. The elderly volunteer behind the counter smiled as I entered. "Checking out early? Most folks rent that lookout for at least a week." "I need information," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the history of the tower. About Martin Caldwell." Her smile faltered. "Where did you hear that name?" I explained what had happened, or some version of it. I didn't mention objects flying or messages appearing in frost. Just that I'd found an old article about a lookout who died, and experienced some strange occurrences that made me curious. The volunteer, Carol, according to her name tag, studied me for a long moment before sighing. "We don't usually talk about it. Bad for tourism." She pulled out a thick binder from beneath the counter and flipped through it until she found what she wanted. "Here," she said, turning the binder toward me. "Martin Caldwell. Started as a fire lookout in 1962. Died in 67 during a lightning storm." The photograph was the same one I'd seen on my laptop. The stern face, the proud stance before the tower. "The strange thing," Carol continued, lowering her voice, "is that there wasn't actually a storm warning that day. The report says he was ordered to evacuate because of an approaching storm, but weather records show clear skies. No other stations reported lightning, just Ravenwood Tower." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the ranger station. "So what really happened to him?" Carol shrugged. "Official cause of death was lightning strike, but the autopsy found irregularities." She hesitated. "There were burns, yes, but not consistent with lightning. And his lungs." She shook her head. "They were full of ash, as if he'd breathed in fire." My mouth went dry. The tower was decommissioned after that? For 30 years. Then the Park Service renovated it as a rental about 15 years ago. She eyed me curiously. "You're the first person to check out early. Most guests love it there." I thought about asking if others had reported strange experiences, but decided against it. I'd heard enough. "Thank you," I said, turning to leave. "Wait," Carol called after me. I almost forgot. You left something here when you checked in. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small object, sliding it across to me. A smooth black pebble. I stared at it, unable to move, to breathe. Sir? Your rock, Carol prompted. With numb fingers, I picked it up. Cold. Unnaturally cold. I never left this here, I whispered. Carol frowned. Of course you did. Along with the liability waiver. Don't you remember? I didn't argue. I pocketed the stone and walked out on unsteady legs. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to put it behind me, to forget the tower and everything that happened there. I finished my manuscript. A very different story than the one I'd planned. And my agent says it's the best work I've ever done. But I can't escape what followed me home. Started small. The sound of labored breathing in empty rooms. Objects not quite where I left them. The temperature dropping suddenly, inexplicably. Black pebbles appearing on my pillow, my desk, inside my shoes. Then the fire alarms began going off in my apartment building. Always at night. Always with no cause that maintenance could find. Always bringing that suffocating feeling, that unbearable heat that vanishes when I flee outside. Last night, I woke to find my bedroom filled with smoke so thick I couldn't see the walls. I choked, gasping for air that wasn't there, crawling blindly toward where I thought the door should be. My lungs burned, my eyes streamed. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was dying. Then my laptop screen illuminated across the room, cutting through the smoke with pale blue light. Words appeared, typing themselves across the screen. The fire is coming, Daniel. Someone must watch, someone must warn. Your turn, your duty, your tower. As suddenly as it had appeared, the smoke vanished. The air cleared. I could breathe again. I booked a flight back to Oregon this morning. I'm writing this from the airport, these final words before I return to the tower. To my tower now, I suppose. Martin Caldwell died doing what he believed was his duty, watching for fire, protecting the forest. But something went wrong. Something trapped him there. Binding him to his post long after death should have released him. For decades he remained, alone and vigilant against a threat that never came, or perhaps never ended, until I arrived and gave him someone to pass his duty to. I don't know what will happen when I climb those stairs again. If I'll find Martin waiting, ready to relinquish his eternal watch. If I'll see the fire he's been warning about all these years. If I'll take his place among the black pebbles and frost messages and whispering winds. I only know that the burning in my lungs won't stop until I return. The phantom smoke follows me everywhere now. The heat builds with each passing hour. And always, just at the edge of hearing, that labored breathing and a voice that whispers, "Your tower now, Daniel. Your duty now." The final boarding call for my flight is echoing through the terminal. It's time to go back. Time to take my place. Time to watch for fire. The first time it happened, I was charting the weather. A simple task: record the barometric pressure, wind speed, and temperature. Standard procedure when you're the keeper of Blackrock Lighthouse, miles from the nearest town on Maine's most desolate stretch of coastline. I'd been here 3 weeks, still settling into the rhythm of isolation that comes with a 6-month posting. My pencil rolled across the logbook. Nothing unusual about that, except the desk was perfectly level. I checked with a spirit level when I arrived, and the pencil rolled uphill. Just a trick of perception, I told myself. The mind plays games when you live alone, perched on a jagged black rock with only the Atlantic for company. I retrieved the pencil and continued my work. Later that night, I awoke to the sound of my name. Thomas. It was barely audible beneath the constant symphony of waves crashing against the rocks below. A gentle whisper, as if carried on the breeze. Thomas. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice had sounded like it came from the corner of my bedroom, but no one was there. Just the shadowy silhouette of my coat hanging on the back of my door, swaying slightly in the draft from the window I'd left cracked to let in fresh air. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the darkness. No response. Just the distant foghorn from a passing ship and the ever-present roar of the ocean. I blamed it on dreams, on the boundary between sleep and wakefulness where the mind manufactures phantoms. I rolled over and tried to fall back asleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake until dawn painted the room in shades of gray and blue. The lighthouse had stood on Black Rock since 1887. Built to warn ships away from the treacherous reef that had claimed dozens of vessels. It had been automated in the 1980s, but still required a keeper for maintenance and monitoring. When the position opened, I jumped at the opportunity. After 15 years working data entry in Portland, the isolation appealed to me. A chance to disconnect, to write the novel I'd been planning for years, to escape the noise of the world. The lighthouse itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering. A 120-foot tower of granite blocks rising from the center of a 2-story stone keeper's house. The house was surprisingly spacious. A kitchen and living area downstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs, and a small study off the master bedroom. The previous keeper had left abruptly. Family emergency, my supervisor had explained when handing over the keys. Never even came back for his personal effects. Those effects had been boxed up and placed in the basement storage room, and I'd been instructed not to disturb them until someone came to collect them. No one had. 3 days after hearing my name in the darkness, I dropped a mug of coffee. It shattered on the kitchen floor, dark liquid spreading across the aged linoleum. As I bent to clean it up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The coffee wasn't spreading randomly. It was forming a perfect circle, defying the slight incline of the floor. Then, before my eyes, it began to ripple. Not from the center outward, but from the edges inward, as if being drawn to some invisible point at the center of the circle. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks. When I looked again, the coffee was just a normal puddle, seeping into the cracks of the linoleum. That night, I double-checked all the doors and windows before going to bed. The lighthouse stood isolated on its rocky perch, accessible only by a narrow causeway that flooded during high tide. No one could reach me without my knowledge. I was alone. Yet as I drifted toward sleep, I heard it again. "Thomas, I know you can hear me." This time, the voice was clearer. It had an odd, liquid quality to it, as if spoken underwater. I shot upright, fumbling for the lamp on my bedside table. The light revealed nothing unusual in my bedroom, but I could have sworn the air felt different, heavier, saturated with something I couldn't name. I slept with the light on that night. In the morning, I convinced myself I was experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and the constant background noise of the sea. I'd read somewhere that lighthouse keepers often developed peculiar sensory experiences. It was an occupational hazard, but the incidents continued, growing more difficult to rationalize. I found my clothes arranged in a perfect spiral on the bedroom floor one morning, though I distinctly remembered hanging them in the closet. The radio would turn itself on, always tuned to static. Doors I had closed would be open when I returned, and vice versa. The weather turned harsh in my 4th week, a nor'easter battering the lighthouse with wind and rain. The power flickered, and I spent my evenings by lantern light, reading from the small collection of books left by previous keepers. Most were practical guides to lighthouse maintenance, navigation, or local marine life. But one caught my eye, a slim volume bound in faded green cloth, with no title on its spine. Inside, I found a handwritten journal, the ink faded to a rusty brown. The entries were dated 1897, signed by A.J. Marlowe, who had apparently been the lighthouse keeper at that time. The early entries were mundane accounts of weather conditions, passing ships, and supply deliveries. But around page 20 the tone changed. November 15, 1897. I have begun to hear peculiar noises from the tower at night. Not the wind, which I know well, but something else. Something that scrapes against the stone walls, as if trying to find a way in. December 3, 1897. The noise grows worse. Last night I distinctly heard my name called, though no ships have passed for days and I am quite alone here. I must be overtired. December 10, 1897. I found all my tools arranged in a perfect circle this morning, though I am certain I left them in the toolbox. The isolation plays tricks on the mind, I am told. I shall write to request leave after the holiday. The entries continued, growing increasingly disturbed. Marlowe described objects moving of their own accord, strange whispers, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The final entry was dated January 18, 1898. It is in the lighthouse now. I hear it climbing the stairs at night, dragging something heavy behind it. The light must be maintained, but I fear going up there after dark. It knows my name. It knows what I did. God forgive me. I cannot stay another night. The journal ended there. I closed it, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The coincidence was unsettling. Marlowe had experienced the same phenomena that were now happening to me, but that had been over a century ago. Surely there was a rational explanation. As if in response to my thoughts, the lantern beside me flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, I heard a wet, sliding sound coming from the spiral staircase that led to the lighthouse tower. Something was dragging itself up the stairs. I sat frozen in the darkness, listening to the slow, methodical sounds. A soft thud, followed by what sounded like something heavy and damp being pulled across stone. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The rational part of my mind suggested it could be an injured seabird that had somehow found its way inside. Or perhaps some debris from the storm had come loose and was being blown against the stairs by the wind. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that recognizes danger on an instinctual level, knew better. Whatever was climbing those stairs wasn't natural. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate my surroundings. The beam caught dust particles floating in the air, which seemed to move in strange, deliberate patterns rather than drifting randomly. I directed the light toward the staircase door. It was closed as I had left it, but moisture was seeping under it. A dark puddle spreading across the floor toward me. The puddle moved against gravity, flowing uphill, defying every natural law. I backed away, nearly tripping over an ottoman. The puddle stopped its advance, rippling slightly as if considering its next move. Then the doorknob began to turn. I ran up the stairs to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. Childish, perhaps, what kind of entity would be stopped by a locked door if it could manipulate physical objects and defy gravity? But fear isn't rational. I sat on my bed, back against the headboard, eyes fixed on the door. The house had fallen silent again.
No dragging sounds, no whispers.
Just the storm outside, wind howling around the lighthouse tower. After what felt like hours, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I awoke to find my bedroom floor covered in water. Not flooded, the water was arranged in an intricate pattern of swirls and whirls, defying gravity as it clung to the walls and ceiling as well. In the center of the pattern, directly above my bed, the water had formed a perfect face. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, mouth open in what might have been a scream or a hungry gasp. I scrambled out of bed, but there was nowhere to go. The water pattern followed me, rearranging itself to keep the face centered above me. From the face, a voice emerged, the same underwater voice I'd been hearing, but now unmistakably clear. "Thomas," it gurgled. "You're just like him." I fled to the kitchen, grabbing my satellite phone to call for evacuation. But when I tried to dial out, I heard only a strange, bubbling sound, as if the phone had been submerged. The screen showed 5 missed calls, all from the same number, my own. The weather made evacuation impossible anyway. The Coast Guard wouldn't be able to reach Black Rock until the storm passed, which could be days. I was trapped with whatever presence had infested the lighthouse. The rational part of my mind still fought for control. I told myself it was cabin fever, perhaps even carbon monoxide poisoning from the old heating system. I checked the detector, it showed normal levels, but maybe it was malfunctioning. I spent the day in a fever of activity, checking every system in the lighthouse, looking for any explanation other than the obvious one. That Black Rock lighthouse was haunted. By evening, the storm had intensified. The lighthouse windows rattled in their frames, and the wind howled like a living thing. I sat in the kitchen, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table before me, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I remembered the boxes in the basement, the personal effects of the previous keeper. Perhaps there were answers there. The basement was accessed through a heavy trapdoor in the kitchen floor. I hadn't been down there since my arrival, having no reason to disturb the musty space. Now, armed with a flashlight and the courage provided by whiskey, I descended the narrow wooden stairs. The basement was surprisingly large, extending beneath the entire house. Stone walls wept with moisture, and the air had a heavy, organic smell. Not just damp, but something else. Something brackish and rotten. The previous keeper's belongings were stacked in one corner, 3 cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape. I opened the first one, finding clothes, books, and personal items. Nothing unusual. The second box contained paperwork, bills, letters, a dog-eared copy of the lighthouse manual. The third box was heavier than the others. Inside, wrapped in a plastic tarp, I found a collection of old glass bottles and jars, all filled with seawater and sealed with wax. Each bore a handwritten label with a date and a name. The oldest jar was dated 1887, the year the lighthouse was built. The most recent was dated just 3 months ago, shortly before my arrival. I picked up one of the bottles, holding it to the light. The water inside was cloudy, with something dark floating in it. As I watched, the dark mass pressed itself against the glass, forming what looked like fingers. I dropped the bottle in shock. It didn't break, but rolled across the uneven floor, coming to rest against the far wall. That's when I noticed the wall didn't look right. Unlike the other 3 walls of the basement, which were made of fitted stone blocks, this one was rougher, more hastily constructed. And in one spot, the mortar between the stones was fresher, lighter in color. I approached the wall, running my fingers over the newer section. The mortar crumbled easily, still not fully cured. I used a screwdriver from my pocket to dig at it, removing chunks until I could grip one of the stones and pull it free. Behind the stone was a cavity, and in the cavity was a sealed mason jar, identical to the ones in the box. This one had my name on it. The date was listed as tomorrow. The jar was empty, waiting to be filled. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The implications were too horrific to contemplate. I turned to flee, but the basement door slammed shut above me. The light from my flashlight began to dim, the batteries draining at an impossible rate. In the fading light, I saw the water from the bottles I disturbed flowing across the floor, not spreading out but gathering together, rising up like a column. It took shape before my eyes, a vaguely humanoid figure composed entirely of dark water. "Every keeper pays the price," the figure gurgled, its voice the same one that had been whispering my name. "Every keeper feeds the light." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice a terrified whisper. "I am what keeps the light burning," it replied. "I am the souls of those who came before, those who were judged and found wanting." The water figure extended what might have been an arm, pointing to the wall where I'd found the jar with my name. 137 years, 137 keepers, each one adding to my strength. The flashlight died completely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. I felt cold, wet hands on my ankles, my wrists, my throat. "You're not the first to discover the truth," the voice said, now seeming to come from all around me. "Marlowe found it. So did the one before you. They all find it eventually, and then they join me." I struggled against the impossible grip, but it was like fighting against the ocean itself. The hands pulled me down toward the stone floor, which now felt soft and yielding, like mud, like quicksand. "The lighthouse must be maintained," the voice whispered. "The light must never go out. That is the burden. That is the price." As I sank into what should have been solid stone, I understood at last. The lighthouse wasn't built to warn ships away from the reef. It was built to contain something ancient and hungry that had been feeding on lighthouse keepers for generations. And now it was my turn. They'll find the lighthouse empty when they finally come to check on me. The logbook will be meticulously maintained until the very last entry. My personal belongings will be boxed up and stored in the basement for the next keeper to find. And somewhere in the walls, in a jar bearing my name, something of me will remain. Another voice in the chorus that whispers in the night. Another pair of watery hands to drag the next unsuspecting soul down into the darkness. The light must never go out. That is our burden now. If you find yourself appointed as the keeper of Blackrock Lighthouse, heed my warning. When objects begin to move on their own, when you hear your name whispered in the darkness, when water defies gravity, run. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Because understanding comes too late. It always comes too late. Sometimes, late at night, I can still feel my physical body. I think it's somewhere in the foundations of the lighthouse, preserved in the brackish water that permeates the stone. Part of me, but not all. The rest is part of the entity now, the collective consciousness of all the keepers who came before. And when the next keeper arrives, I'll be the one to whisper their name in the darkness. The light must never go out. That is the burden we bear. The first anomaly was the water. I noticed it as I descended the final flight of crumbling concrete stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the damp walls of the abandoned water treatment facility. The beam caught something in the massive filtration basin below, a ripple across what should have been stagnant water. Just one perfect concentric circle, as if a single droplet had fallen from above. But nothing had fallen. The ceiling was solid concrete, and I was alone. I froze, listening. The facility had been decommissioned for nearly 30 years, buried beneath the expanding wetlands outside of town where no one ventured anymore. The massive underground complex had been designed to process water for a city that never materialized, a failed development project abandoned in the 1970s energy crisis. Now it was just a forgotten subterranean labyrinth of concrete and rusting pipes, half-flooded and entirely forgotten. That's why I was here, to document the forgotten places. At least that's what I told myself. I waited, barely breathing, watching the water. After 90 seconds of perfect stillness, I convinced myself it had been a trick of light on my exhausted eyes. I'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, driving through the night to reach this location, following coordinates I'd found buried in declassified EPA documents regarding water table anomalies. The beam of my flashlight revealed the immensity of the main processing chamber. Colossal pipes emerged from the walls like metallic intestines, leading to a series of enormous filtration basins. The ceiling soared 30 feet above, supported by concrete pillars thick as redwoods. Everything was slick with condensation, the air heavy and metallic. I took another step down and the sound echoed. That's when I realized what was wrong. The echo was wrong, continued too long, repeating not just once but 3 times, each slightly different in tone, like something was mimicking my footsteps. I froze again, heart thudding against my ribs. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice bounced around the chamber, distorting with each reflection until the final echo sounded nothing like my voice at all. The final reverberation was lower, almost a growl. Get a grip, I told myself. It was just the unusual acoustics of the chamber. I'd studied the blueprints. I was at least 40 feet underground, with no cellular reception and 3 miles of wetlands between me and the nearest road. No one knew I was here. No one could be here. I continued down the final steps, wincing as my boots splashed into an inch of standing water on the concrete floor. The flashlight revealed a control room to my right, its windows shattered long ago, broken glass glittering on the floor like fallen stars. I stepped carefully through the doorway, sweeping my light across what remained of the equipment. Analog dials, massive switches, and control panels covered in a patina of rust and mineral deposits. A clipboard still hung from a hook on the wall, its pages fused together by decades of dampness. The light from my flashlight dimmed suddenly, flickering with an orange hue before returning to normal. I tapped it against my palm, but the problem wasn't mechanical. The batteries were new. Something on the control panel caught my eye. A single LED light glowing red. Impossible. The power had been cut decades ago. Yet there it was, a tiny crimson eye watching me from the dead control panel. I approached slowly, trying to make sense of it. The light was on a panel labeled Depth Irregularity Detection. As I leaned closer, it blinked once, then went dark. I exhaled shakily, fumbling to retrieve my camera from my backpack. I needed to document this, an electrical system somehow still partially functioning after all these years. Perhaps there was a backup generator somewhere, its dying breaths powering random circuits. As I raised the camera to my eye, a low hum began. So deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. It vibrated through the floor, through the water at my feet, through my bones. The surface of the water began to tremble. Not ripples this time, but a strange geometric pattern, like tiny standing waves forming perfect hexagons across the puddles at my feet. I lowered the camera slowly, watching in fascination as the pattern grew more complex. The water was organizing itself, something that defied the physics I understood. I knelt down for a closer look, and the pattern immediately dissolved back into ordinary puddles. "What the hell?" I whispered. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound my ears rang with it. Then, from somewhere deep within the facility, came a sound like metal grinding against metal. A massive valve turning, perhaps, or a bulkhead door opening. I stood, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. The only exit was the stairway I'd descended. Every instinct told me to leave, to climb those stairs and not look back. But I'd driven 10 hours to get here. I couldn't leave without photographs, without evidence. Evidence of what? I wasn't sure anymore. I stepped back into the main chamber, directing my flashlight toward the source of the sound. The beam penetrated about 50 feet before dissipating into darkness. The far end of the chamber was invisible, swallowed by shadow that seemed denser than it should be. I took a step forward, and my flashlight flickered again, this time going completely dark for 3 full seconds. When it returned, the water at my feet had receded. The floor was dry in a perfect circle around me, as if the water had deliberately moved away. My hand trembled, causing the light beam to dance. I steadied it with my other hand and continued forward, drawn to a large pipe that emerged from the far wall. As I approached, I noticed something that hadn't been visible from the entrance. A symbol etched into the concrete beside the pipe. It wasn't industrial marking. It looked older, carved by hand, a series of concentric circles with straight lines bisecting them at odd angles. It reminded me vaguely of astronomical charts I'd seen in museums, but this was different. Wrong somehow. I raised my camera again, focusing on the strange symbol, but when I checked the preview screen, the image was distorted, the symbol appeared blurred, as if in motion. The grinding sound came again, closer this time, followed by a rush of air so cold it burned my lungs when I inhaled. The temperature in the chamber had dropped at least 20 degrees in seconds. That's when I saw it, my breath forming in the air before me. But instead of dissipating normally, the cloud hung suspended, gradually shaping itself into what looked disturbingly like a face, hollow eyes, a gaping mouth. It held this form for 3 seconds before collapsing. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. This was impossible. I blinked hard, wondering if I was hallucinating from exhaustion or perhaps exposed to some chemical residue in this forgotten place. "Just go," I told myself aloud. "Just turn around and go." But my voice sounded wrong to my ears, too hollow, too distant, as if I were hearing a recording of myself rather than my actual voice. I turned back toward the stairs, but hesitated. Something was different. I swept my flashlight across the chamber, trying to identify what had changed. Then I realized the control room was gone. Where the doorway had been minutes before was now just solid concrete wall. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." I ran to the wall, pressing my palms against it. Cold, solid concrete. No seam, no indication there had ever been a doorway there. I looked up at the staircase I descended. It was still there, but now it seemed to climb higher than before, the upper levels lost in darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I closed my eyes, counting to 10 slowly. When I opened them, nothing had changed. The control room was still gone. The stairs still stretched impossibly upward. Get it together, I hissed through clenched teeth. You're tired. You're disoriented. The humming returned, louder now, making my teeth vibrate. The water that had receded from around me began to flow back, not randomly but in thin, deliberate rivulets that formed patterns across the concrete floor, shapes that resembled letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. My flashlight dimmed again, and this time I knew it wasn't the batteries. The darkness itself seemed to be thickening, becoming almost tangible. From that darkness came a voice, so distorted by echo I almost missed the words. Remember the reservoir, Jacob? Age 7. The ice broke. My blood turned to ice. No one called me Jacob anymore. I'd gone by Jake since college. And no one alive knew about the reservoir, about the accident when I was 7. I'd fallen through thin ice, been trapped under the frozen surface for nearly 2 minutes before my father pulled me out. I'd never told anyone about the faces I thought I'd seen looking up at me through the ice while I was submerged, faces that weren't my reflection. Who's there? I demanded, my voice cracking. The only response was another grinding sound, and then a splash from the large filtration basin behind me. I spun around, directing my light toward it. The beam caught something rising from the water, a hand, pale and dripping. Then another hand. They gripped the concrete edge of the basin, but there was something wrong with them. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch as a figure pulled itself slowly from the basin, water cascading from its form. In the stuttering light of my failing flashlight, I couldn't see it clearly. Just a humanoid shape, too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and wrong. It stood at the edge of the basin, water still pouring from it, but the water wasn't behaving correctly. Instead of falling, it began to spiral around the figure, suspended in the air like orbiting planets. You came back, the voice said, clearer now but still distorted, as if speaking through liquid. After all this time, my mind reeled. I'd never been here before. I'd never even been to this part of the country until today. Had I? A sudden, blinding pain shot through my temple as a memory tried to surface. A memory of this place, but brighter, functioning, filled with workers. A memory of being led down these same stairs by a man in a lab coat, his face just out of view in my mind's eye. I've never been here, I insisted, as much to myself as to the figure. The human mind protects itself, the figure said, taking a step forward. The movement was wrong, its legs bending in too many places. You were subject 9, the only one who survived contact with the depth. Another flash of pain, another fragmented memory, lying on a metal table, surrounded by people in hazmat suits. A thick black liquid being poured into my mouth, filling my lungs but somehow allowing me to breathe. I clutched my head, dropping to my knees. No, that's not real. I grew up in Connecticut. My father was an accountant. False memories, the figure said, closer now. Implanted after the breach, after what emerged from the depth found you compatible. The humming intensified, becoming a physical pressure against my skin. Water began to rise around me, not flowing from any source but materializing from the air itself, forming a circle that rose like glass walls. In the reflection of this impossible water, I caught glimpses of myself, but wrong, my eyes completely black, my skin translucent, dark veins pulsing beneath. What's happening to me? I gasped. You're remembering what you are, the figure said, now close enough that I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human, never had been. Its form was only approximately humanoid, like something that had studied human anatomy from descriptions rather than observations. Its face was smooth except for 3 vertical slits where eyes and mouth should be. The water wall around me began to fill with images. Not reflections, but scenes from a life I didn't recognize. A child being led through this facility. A teenager strapped to a chair while black liquid was forced down his throat. A young man standing at the edge of the filtration basin while scientists took notes. Me, all me. That's not possible, I said, but my conviction was faltering. I remember my childhood, my parents, school. We gave you those memories when we sent you to the surface, the figure said, reaching toward me with those impossibly articulated fingers. You were our emissary, our scout, programmed to return when the stars aligned. Another memory flashed, standing before a strange astronomical device in this very chamber, watching as mechanical arms tracked the movement of celestial bodies, waiting for a specific configuration. A timer that counted down decades. I looked at my camera, suddenly realizing why I'd felt compelled to come here, why I'd spent months researching abandoned water treatment facilities, why this specific location had called to me across thousands of miles. I hadn't come to document this place. I come to reactivate it. With trembling hands, I reached into my backpack and removed something I didn't remember packing. A small metallic cube covered in the same symbols I'd seen etched in the concrete. What is this? I asked, though part of me already knew. The key, the figure said, to open the way. The water wall collapsed around me, soaking me to the skin. But it wasn't water. It was too thick, too cold, and it didn't drip from my clothes but rather seemed to absorb into them, into my skin. I gasped as it penetrated my pores, filling me with icy knowledge. I remembered everything now, what this facility really was. Not a water treatment plant, but a containment site for something discovered deep beneath a dried lakebed in 1967. Something that had once been worshipped by an ancient civilization that understood water was not just H2O but a medium, a doorway. I remembered being chosen as a child, being compatible in ways the scientists didn't understand but desperately wanted to study. I remembered the experiments, the alterations, the preparation. The figure stepped closer, and I no longer found it frightening. I recognized it now, a manifestation of what lived in the depth, what had been partially constrained by the concrete and steel of this facility. It's time, isn't it? I asked, my voice changing, deepening, acquiring the same liquid quality as the figures. Yes, Jacob, the alignment comes in hours. The doorway must be opened. I looked at the cube in my hands, understanding now why I'd been sent away decades ago, why I'd been programmed to return on this specific date. I was both key and keymaster, altered to withstand what was coming. I stood, no longer afraid but filled with purpose. My flashlight lay forgotten on the ground, but I no longer needed it. I could see perfectly in the darkness now, could see the true nature of this place, the enormous machine disguised as a water treatment facility, designed to channel and control something ancient when the stars aligned. As I walked toward the main filtration basin, I was aware of changes in my body, my joints loosening, my vision shifting to perceive spectra beyond human range. The black liquid had fully incorporated into my system now, transforming me into something that could survive what was coming. Behind me, the stairs that had led to the surface collapsed with a thunderous roar. There would be no going back. But I didn't need to go back. My false life, my implanted memories, they seemed distant now, belonging to someone else. I reached the edge of the basin and looked down into the black water. It wasn't water at all, but a thin membrane over a void that descended far deeper than the blueprints had shown. Far deeper than should be possible given the local geology. I held the cube over the surface, watching as it began to glow with a deep purple light, casting no reflection on the liquid below. What will happen to the surface? To the people? I asked, a last flicker of my human identity asserting itself. The figure placed its hand on my shoulder, its touch neither warm nor cold. Change, it said simply, as all things must. As you have, the depth must rise. The surface must submerge. I understood then what we were about to unleash. Not destruction, at least not entirely, but transformation. What dwelled in the depth had been here long before humanity, would be here long after. It didn't hate us. We simply occupied space it needed to reclaim. I hesitated for just a moment, remembering the false family I'd believed was real, the false life I'd lived for decades. Then I dropped the cube. It broke the surface without a splash, descending into the void. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the entire facility began to vibrate, concrete cracking, rust flaking from the ancient pipes. The liquid in the basin began to rise, not as water rises, but as if space itself were being displaced, reality folding to allow something through. It formed a column that reached toward the ceiling, thickening, darkening, beginning to take shape. I watched without fear as the column bent toward me, as a face formed within it. A face with features that shifted constantly, never settling on a single configuration. It regarded me for a long moment, recognizing what I had once been and what I had become. Then it spoke, not in words but directly into my mind. You have prepared the way. The doorway opens. The depth rises. The column engulfed me, and I surrendered to it completely. As my consciousness began to dissolve, merging with something vast and ancient, I had one final human thought. No one will ever know what happened here. No one will find this place or my body or any trace of what is about to emerge. The world above will change, and no one will understand why. Then even that thought dissolved, and I became part of the rising depth, part of the tide that would soon sweep across the surface world. Not an ending, but a return to what had always been. The last thing I perceived as Jacob was the cube, now floating back to the surface, its purpose fulfilled, its purple glow spreading outward like ripples in a still pond. But ripples always reach the shore eventually, and shores can be reshaped by what emerges from the deep. The first time I heard it, I was checking the pressure gauges in the eastern wing. A rhythmic clicking that didn't belong among the ambient sounds of the abandoned desalination plant. 3 clicks, then 2, then 4. Pause. 3, 2, 4. A pattern too deliberate to be settling pipes or scavenging wildlife. I stood motionless, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the cavernous filtration chamber. The clicking stopped, then started again, now coming from behind me. 3, 2, 4. Pause. 3, 2, 4. This section of the coastal facility hadn't been operational in decades. Salt-corroded metal and crumbling concrete stretched in all directions, forming a labyrinth of industrial decay half buried in the cliffside. The nearest town was 30 miles north, and my cell phone showed no service. Not that I expected any. I'd come here alone to photograph these ruins for my architecture blog on forgotten infrastructure, something I'd done countless times before at other locations. But never had I felt so immediately, viscerally wrong about a place. Outside, a winter storm battered the coastline. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying the scent of brine and something else. Something stagnant and faintly metallic. High tide wasn't due for hours, yet I could already hear waves crashing closer than they should be, as though the ocean itself was eager to reclaim this place. I swept my light across the chamber again, illuminating the massive cylindrical tanks and the maze of catwalks suspended above them. The clicking had stopped, but now came a new sound, water dripping in the same pattern. 3 drops, 2 drops for drops. Pause. Repeat. My rational mind knew this was impossible. Yet the dripping followed the clicking's cadence exactly. Hello! My voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing from metal to concrete and back again, distorting into something unrecognizable. No response came except for the persistent dripping. I followed the sound deeper into the facility, through narrow corridors where moisture beaded on the walls despite the dehumidifiers the Preservation Society had installed last summer. According to my research, this place had been abandoned in 1967 after an unexplained accident claimed the lives of 9 workers. The official report cited equipment failure, but local legends suggested something more sinister. Tales of workers hearing voices from the intake pipes, of hallucinations and violent behavior in the weeks before the tragedy. Just internet folklore, I had told myself. Until now, the dripping led me to the main pumping station. A massive chamber filled with rusted machinery, its ceiling lost in darkness despite my flashlight's beam. The rhythmic sound was louder here, no longer dripping but splashing, as though someone was methodically disturbing the surface of water. Yet the floor was dry. 3 splashes, 2 splashes, for splashes. Pause. Repeat. My flashlight beam caught something on the far wall, a dark discoloration about 6 feet high, glistening wet despite being well above any possible water line. As I approached, the shape resolved itself into something that stopped me cold. It was a handprint, a human handprint pressed into the concrete as though the wall had been soft clay when it was made. The moisture collected in its center, building until it had enough volume to drip down. 3 drops, 2 drops for drops. before the process began again. I raised my own hand beside it. The print was smaller, with elongated fingers that tapered to points too sharp for human anatomy. The skin texture preserved in the impression wasn't the normal ridges and whorls of a human palm, but something more like the surface of an octopus, a pattern of fine, intersecting circles. Something fell behind me with a hollow metallic clang. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight beam caught nothing but empty space and silent machinery. When I turned back to the wall, the handprint was gone. The concrete was completely dry and unmarked. I took a step backward, then another. The rational explanations, tricks of light, an overtired mind, old building settling, felt paper-thin against the certainty that something was terribly wrong here. I needed to leave, to return in daylight with company. I turned to retrace my steps through the labyrinth of pipes and tanks. That's when I realized I couldn't remember which corridor I'd used to enter this chamber. What had been a clear mental map just minutes ago was now a confused jumble of identical passageways. I chose the widest corridor, reasoning it must be the main access route. The beam of my flashlight seemed dimmer now, barely penetrating the darkness ahead. The air grew colder with each step, carrying that same metallic smell, stronger now. Not rust or salt water, but something organic, something dead. The corridor ended in a room I hadn't photographed or even seen before. A perfect circle with a pool of black water at its center. Not part of the original facility design I'd studied. The pool was at least 20 feet across, its surface perfectly still despite the distant sound of the storm. Curved symbols I didn't recognize were carved into the stone around its circumference, their edges worn smooth by time or touch. I knew I should turn around, find another way out. Yet I found myself moving closer to the pool, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. My flashlight beam skated across the water's surface, revealing nothing of what lay beneath. Then the blackness moved, not a ripple or wave, but a deliberate shifting, as though the darkness itself was viscous and alive. I froze, watching as the center of the pool began to rise, forming a column of midnight water that defied physics. It grew taller, shaping itself into something vaguely humanoid before collapsing back with a splash that should have soaked me. But the floor remained inexplicably dry. 3 splashes, 2 splashes, for splashes. A cold realization washed over me. It was communicating, or trying to. "What do you want?" My voice came out as a whisper, swallowed by the unnatural acoustics of the circular room. The surface of the pool remained still for several heartbeats. Then, so quickly I might have missed it by blinking, words formed on the surface of the water. Not ripples but actual text, as though written by an invisible finger on black glass. "You have been here before." The message lingered for 3 seconds before the water became an ordinary pool again. I staggered backward, my heel catching on the uneven floor. As I caught my balance, my flashlight beam swept across the far wall, where a faded photograph hung in a rusted frame. I approached it slowly, dread building with each step. The photograph showed a group of men standing before the desalination plant on what appeared to be its opening day in 1945. 8 men in work clothes, 1 in a suit, presumably the manager. Standard historical documentation, except for the 10th figure. Standing at the edge of the group was a face I recognized instantly. My own. Not someone who resembled me, but me, identical in every detail down to the small scar above my right eyebrow from a childhood accident. The face stared out from the decades-old photograph with an expression I couldn't decipher. Not quite a smile, not quite fear. "This isn't possible," I whispered, reaching toward the photograph with trembling fingers. The moment I touched the frame, the image changed. The men remained the same, but my doppelganger was gone. In its place was a dark silhouette with no distinguishable features. I yanked my hand back as though burned, and the photograph reverted to its previous state. Me standing there in 1945, looking out across more than 70 years. My head began to throb with a sudden, intense pressure. Fragments of memories that couldn't be mine flashed through my consciousness. The taste of salt water, the sound of screaming metal, darkness pressing in from all sides. The sensation of drowning, but not in water, in time. I stumbled away from the photograph, desperate to escape this room, This building, the weight of impossible knowledge pressing against my skull. The exit I'd used to enter was gone, replaced by solid concrete. Another appeared on the opposite side, one I was certain hadn't existed before. With no choice, I hurried through it, emerging into a long, descending hallway I didn't recognize. The walls here were different. Not industrial concrete, but something older, stone blocks fitted together with precision that spoke of a different era entirely. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of the same curved symbols from the pool room, carved into keystones and lintels. The corridor ended in a massive chamber that defied all architectural logic. It should have extended well beyond the cliff face and out over the ocean, yet here it was, impossibly contained within the desalination plant. The ceiling soared at least 40 feet high, supported by columns of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At the center stood what appeared to be an altar of some kind, a flat slab of the same black stone, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Surrounding it in a perfect circle were 9 chairs, also black stone, each occupied by a mannequin-like figure wearing the tattered remains of 1960s work clothes. No, not mannequins. Bodies, mummified by salt and time, preserved in grotesque eternal sitting positions. The 9 workers who died in the accident. Their faces were turned toward the altar, frozen in expressions of what might have been rapture or terror. The pressure in my head increased, bringing with it more impossible memories. These men alive, their voices raised in some kind of chant, the pattern of 324 underlying their words. The rising water, the thing that answered their call. I had to leave. I turned to flee back up the corridor, only to find it sealed shut, seamless stone where the opening had been moments before. Panic clawed at my throat as I spun around, searching for another exit. There was none. The only sound in the chamber was my ragged breathing and the distant crash of waves, closer now than before. High tide approaching, but how much time had passed? It felt like minutes since I'd entered the plant, yet the quality of darkness beyond the broken windows had changed, deepened to the absolute black of deepest night. Had I lost time? Hours of it? I checked my watch. 3:24 a.m. I'd arrived at the plant around 4:30 p.m., almost 11 hours gone.
Impossible.
A soft scraping sound drew my attention back to the circle of bodies. One of them had moved, its head now turned toward me instead of the altar. As I watched, frozen in horror, its desiccated jaw worked slowly open and closed. No sound emerged, but I could read the words forming on its withered lips. Join us. Complete the circle. Another body turned its head. Then another. Soon all 9 faces were oriented toward me, 9 sets of lips moving in silent unison. Join us. Complete the circle. It needs 10. The floor beneath my feet began to tremble. Not the violent shaking of an earthquake, but a gentle, rhythmic vibration. 3 pulses, 2 pulses, for pulses. The altar at the center of the room started to glow with a faint blue luminescence that revealed carvings I hadn't noticed before. Intricate depictions of something vast and formless rising from ocean depths. Water began to seep into the chamber from beneath the altar, forming a perfect circle around it before spreading outward toward the ring of seated corpses. It moved with deliberate slowness, like a living thing testing its surroundings. The blue glow reflected in its surface, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly, geometries that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. I pressed my back against the wall where the exit had been, searching desperately for any crack or seam. Nothing. The water continued its advance, now reaching the feet of the seated figures. Upon contact, their desiccated flesh began to change, rehydrating, plumping, taking on the appearance of life even as it remained a grotesque parody. My breath came in short, painful gasps. The pressure in my head had become unbearable, a million fragmented memories fighting for dominance. Memories of this place, these people, that altar. Memories that couldn't be mine yet felt more real than my own past. The water was halfway to my position now. I skirted along the wall, moving away from its advance. As I did, my hand brushed against something metallic embedded in the stone. A small plaque I hadn't noticed before. I angled my flashlight to read the engraved text, In memory of the 10 who were lost May 17, 1967. 10. Not 9. The realization hit me with physical force, driving me to my knees. I wasn't a random visitor. I had been drawn here, called back to complete what had been started decades ago. The 10th sacrifice, temporarily escaped but never truly free. As though responding to this understanding, the water changed course, flowing directly toward me in a narrow stream that moved with impossible purpose. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere left to retreat. The wall behind me softened, became yielding like flesh. It began to envelop me, drawing me into its substance even as the water reached my feet. Cold liquid touched my skin, but it didn't feel like water. It felt like memory, cold and vast and ancient. It soaked through my clothes, weighing me down, while the wall continued to pull me backward into its mass. Caught between two impossible forces, I could only watch as the seated figures began to rise, their reanimated bodies moving with jerky, puppet motions. They formed a line and began to advance, their footsteps creating ripples in the now ankle-deep water. 3 steps, 2 steps, 4 steps. The pattern that had haunted me since I entered this place. The first figure reached me and extended a hand, the same inhuman hand that had left its impression on the wall hours earlier. Up close, I could see that beneath the human exterior was something else entirely, something with skin textured in fine, intersecting circles. Its eyes held the bottomless darkness of the ocean trench. "We've been waiting for you to remember," it said in a voice like drowning. "You ran last time, hid yourself in a new life, new memories." The others formed a semicircle around me, their bodies beginning to shed the human disguise like wet paper, revealing the true forms beneath. Glistening darkness shaped vaguely like men but wrong in proportions and movement. "The gate needs 10, another said, its voice bubbling as though spoken through liquid. 9 to channel, 1 to become. You were chosen to become." The wall had almost completely engulfed me now, only my face remaining free. The entities reached toward me with their 2 long fingers, brushing against my cheeks with cold, wet touch. One by one, they began to dissolve, their substance flowing into the rising water until only formless darkness remained, swirling around me in patterns too complex to comprehend. I felt the last of my resistance fading, replaced by an awful certainty. This was always going to happen. I had merely delayed the inevitable. As the wall finally closed over my face, as water filled my lungs without drowning me, as my consciousness expanded beyond the confines of my body, one final memory surfaced. I hadn't escaped in 1967. I had been sent out. A fragment of something much larger, dispatched into the world to learn, to grow, to gather experiences that would enrich the whole upon my return. My entire life had been borrowed time, a temporary existence that was never truly mine. The transformation doesn't hurt as I expected. It feels like remembering who I truly am, like awakening from a pleasant but shallow dream into a deeper reality. My human consciousness is being absorbed into something vast and ancient, something that has waited patiently beneath this forgotten place for my return. As the last remnants of my humanity dissolve, I become aware of the ocean beyond these walls, the true home of what I am becoming. I sense the tide reaching its peak, water pressing against the weakened barriers of the old facility. Soon, very soon, these walls will breach, and what has been contained here will flow back to the depths where it belongs. The pattern that haunted me becomes clear in its meaning. 3 tides, 2 moons, for stars in alignment. The time is now. The circle is complete. I am the 10th. I am the gate. I am the way, and the way is open. The last human thought I have, as the walls around me begin to crack and seaborne darkness pushes through, is a moment of perfect clarity. This cycle has happened before and will happen again. Somewhere out there, another fragment has already been dispatched. Another life is being lived in blissful ignorance. Another future sacrifice slowly maturing until the pattern calls it home. 3 beats, 2 beats, for beats. The tide is coming in. The first time I heard it was 3 weeks after I began the site survey. A rhythmic tapping beneath the concrete floor, like water dripping in perfect, unnatural synchronization.
Top, top, top.
Pause.
Top, 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 top.
Pause. Then silence for exactly 27 seconds before it started again. I know because I timed it, convinced some ancient pipe was finally giving way, ready to flood the massive underground structure I'd been hired to document. But there were no pipes left. Not functioning ones, anyway. The Morrison Reservoir and Water Treatment Facility had been abandoned since 1973, when the discovery of industrial chemical seepage rendered it unusable. The county had finally secured funding to demolish it, but first required complete architectural documentation of the structure. Being the only architectural photographer specializing in industrial ruins within 300 miles made me the obvious hire. Being desperate for money after my divorce made me accept the job despite my misgivings about spending weeks alone in the facility. The main treatment building was interesting enough, Art Deco flourishes on a utilitarian concrete shell, for stories of equipment rooms, laboratories, and administrative offices. But the real marvel lay beneath. A labyrinth of underground cisterns, filter beds, and holding tanks stretching for nearly a mile into the mountainside, carved directly into the limestone like catacombs. The tapping started on my first day working in the cisterns. I ignored it, attributing it to settling concrete or my own footsteps echoing back at me from the vaulted chambers. But on the third day, when I stopped moving completely and the sound continued with perfect regularity, I couldn't deny something was off.
Top, top, top.
Pause.
Top, 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 top.
Pause. 27 seconds of silence. I felt it then. The chill that seeped past my thermal layers, past skin and muscle, settling in my marrow with an ancient, patient cold. Not the natural subterranean coolness of the cisterns, but something deliberate, something aware. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the isolation getting to me. The nearest town was 40 minutes away on winding mountain roads, and cell service didn't penetrate this deep underground. I'd bring a radio tomorrow, I told myself, for company. I didn't realize my mistake until the next day, when I plugged in the old battery-powered radio I'd found at a gas station. The static hissed through the cavernous space as I swept through frequencies. Nothing but distant, fractured voices and the occasional burst of forgotten music, until I reached the lower bands. The static cleared. A voice emerged, soft and precise, speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow recognized, as if I'd heard them in a dream I couldn't quite remember. The language had a pattern, the same inflection, the same cadence as the tapping I'd been hearing.
Top, top, top.
Pause.
Top, 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 top.
The voice on the radio matched it perfectly, whispering what sounded like instructions in a language that sounded almost Germanic, but with vowels that stretched too long, consonants that clicked wrongly against teeth. My skin prickled as the voice spoke my name, my full name, including my middle name that I never used, never shared with anyone. I yanked the batteries from the radio, my breathing harsh in the silence. The voice continued for 3 more seconds before dying away, impossible without power. That night, I checked into the only motel in the nearest town, telling myself I needed a hot shower and proper rest. As I unpacked my camera equipment to review the day's photographs, I noticed something strange. In the shots of the main cistern, a cathedral-like chamber with massive concrete pillars, there were smudges where none should be. Curious, I zoomed in. My body went cold. What I'd dismissed as water damage or lens flares were actually handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the concrete walls at impossible heights, 20 or 30 feet up the sheer surfaces. Too small to be adult hands, too numerous to make sense. I scrolled through more images. In each successive photo of the same area, the handprints had moved, inching toward the center of the frame where I had been standing. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in the motel bed, listening to the radiator clank and watching headlights sweep across the ceiling, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The pattern of the radiators knocking suddenly aligned with the tapping from the cisterns. Tap, tap, tap. Pause.
Top, 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 top.
I jerked upright. The bathroom faucet was dripping in the exact same rhythm. My contract required 30 days of work. The money was too good to walk away, especially since the divorce had left me with nothing but debt and this job. 26 more days, I told myself. Document everything, collect the check, Forget this place exists. When I returned the next morning, I brought extra lights, determined to banish whatever shadows had created those illusory handprints. The facility entrance was a massive concrete bunker built into the mountainside, its heavy steel door permanently propped open after the locking mechanism had rusted through decades ago. As I stepped inside, the familiar dank smell enveloped me. Mineral-laden moisture, algae, and something else I couldn't place but reminded me of burnt copper. The main corridor stretched ahead, angling downward into darkness. My footsteps echoed back at me, but something was wrong with the sound. The echoes returned too quickly, as if the space had somehow contracted overnight. When I reached the stairwell leading to the underground levels, I paused to check my equipment one last time. That's when I noticed the mud. Fresh, wet earth smeared in a thin line along the wall at shoulder height, continuing down the stairs. It looked as if someone had walked with their hand dragging against the concrete, leaving a continuous, deliberate streak. I followed it down, through 2 more levels of increasingly narrow corridors, until I reached the entrance to the main cistern. The mud trail disappeared abruptly at the threshold. My camera bag felt suddenly heavy, as if filled with stones instead of equipment. Inside the cathedral-like chamber, my powerful work lights revealed something that hadn't been there the day before. In the center of the vast space, arranged in a perfect circle, were my personal items from the motel room: toothbrush, razor, the novel I'd been reading, even the receipt from dinner, all placed with careful precision, equidistant from each other, forming a circle perhaps 15 feet in diameter. I hadn't been back to the motel since morning. No one else had keys to my room. My heart hammered as I approached the circle, camera clutched to my chest like a shield. How was this possible? The items were bone dry despite the perpetual dampness of the cistern. As I reached the edge of the circle, the air temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me, hanging in the stagnant air rather than dissipating. The mist began to move on its own, swirling and collecting, taking form. I watched, paralyzed, as it shaped itself into a face. Not a human face, but something that understood the concept of human features and had attempted a poor approximation. The eyes were too large, the mouth a gash without proper definition. It hovered at my eye level, regarding me with hollow curiosity. Then it spoke, using the mist to carry sound in a hollow whisper. "You've returned to us again." I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The face dissipated, but the words hung in the air. Again. I had never been here before this job. Never even visited this county until 3 weeks ago. I forced myself to work that day, mechanically photographing the architectural features while avoiding looking directly at the walls where the handprints had been. But in my peripheral vision, I could see them multiplying, spreading across the concrete like a rash. When I aimed my camera deliberately at those sections, the viewfinder showed only blank walls. That evening, as I packed up my gear, I noticed something missing. My journal, where I kept notes on the structure's features and measurements, was gone. I always kept it in my back pocket. Always. I searched frantically, retracing my steps through the facility, but it was nowhere to be found. Back at the motel, I tried to reconstruct my notes from memory, but found gaps I couldn't explain. Entire chambers I documented but couldn't recall. Corridors that seemed to shift position in my recollection. Had I actually gone all the way to the end of the eastern tunnel? I remembered setting up my tripod there, but not what I had photographed. I pulled up the day's images on my laptop to check. Most were as expected: concrete pillars, vaulted ceilings, the intricate system of sluice gates and filter beds. But the final series, the ones from the eastern tunnel, showed something impossible. Me, standing in the frame, back to the camera, facing a wall covered in strange symbols that resembled my own handwriting. But I had been alone. I always worked alone, and I had been the one operating the camera. I zoomed in, hands shaking. The figure wore my clothes, had my build and hair, and beside it on the ground lay my missing journal, open to pages filled with those same symbols. I slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. This was madness. Exhaustion and isolation playing cruel tricks. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by dreams of endless corridors that led deeper and deeper into the mountain. In these dreams, I was following someone. A small figure that left muddy handprints along the walls as it moved. I called out, but it never turned, only paused occasionally to tap against the concrete. Tap, tap, tap. Pause.
Top, 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 top.
I woke to find my missing journal on the nightstand beside the bed, covered in mud and soaking wet. The pages were filled with writing, my handwriting, but in no language I recognized. The same strange symbols from the photograph. When I touched the page, the mud was still wet, my fingers coming away stained with dark earth that smelled of the cisterns. I didn't remember returning to the facility during the night. I didn't remember writing in the journal. But the motel room door showed mud tracked in from outside, and my shoes beside the bed were caked with the same soil. With trembling hands, I called my ex-wife. We hadn't spoken since the divorce 6 months ago, but I needed to hear a familiar voice, to anchor myself to something normal. "Elise," I said when she answered. "I think something's wrong with me." Her voice was cautious. "James, are you okay? I'm working at this abandoned water treatment plant, and strange things are happening. I think I might be, I don't know, having episodes or something." A long silence. Then, "James, you worked at Morrison Reservoir 3 years ago, for that architectural preservation magazine." The world tilted sideways. "No, that's impossible. I just started this job 3 weeks ago." "You had a breakdown there," she continued, her voice strained. "That's when everything started. The memory problems, the night wandering. That's why I left. You kept disappearing for days, then coming back with no memory of where you'd been. The doctors said." I hung up, my throat closing with panic. This wasn't happening. I'd never been here before. I would remember. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop again and searched my email history. Nothing about this current job, no contract, no communication with the county officials who had supposedly hired me. Instead, I found a series of emails from 3 years earlier, an assignment from Architectural Heritage magazine to photograph the Morrison facility before its scheduled demolition. The final email was from my editor, expressing concern after I'd stopped responding for 2 weeks. What followed was a gap in my email history, then hospital records, psychiatric evaluations, divorce papers. The room spun around me. How could I have forgotten all of this? How could I be back here doing the same job with no memory of the first time? Against all reason, I returned to the facility that day. I had to know. The steel entrance door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the structure like a moan of recognition. The corridor stretched before me, but now I noticed details I'd somehow missed or forgotten. Faded graffiti covered the walls near the entrance, mostly obscured by years of mineral deposits. Among the illegible tags and crude drawings, one clear phrase stood out: "James Crane belongs to the deep." My name, written years before I ever came here. Before I came here the first time. I moved through the facility as if guided, no longer needing my sight maps to navigate the labyrinthine passages. My body remembered the way, down 5 levels, past the filtration rooms, through the maintenance tunnels, to a narrow door I didn't recall photographing in my current documentation. It opened to a spiral staircase descending farther than my lights could penetrate. The air rising from below was different. Not the stagnant cool of the cisterns, but a warm, organic breath that carried the scent of earth and decomposition. I should have turned back then, should have run, but something pulled me forward, down the corroded metal steps that creaked beneath my weight. The walls here were different. Not poured concrete but rough-hewn limestone, the bedrock of the mountain itself. And carved into the stone were those same symbols that filled my journal, thousands of them, covering every inch of the passage. After what seemed like hours, the staircase ended at a small chamber. At its center stood a pedestal of natural stone, and atop it lay a book bound in what looked like tarnished copper. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam revealing the immaculate condition of the volume despite the damp environment. It should have been corroded, moldy, destroyed by decades underground. Instead, it looked newly made. With a sense of inescapable destiny, I opened it. The pages were filled with the same symbols, but now I could read them. The language came to me as if remembered from childhood, complex but familiar, describing rituals and bindings, sacrifices and summonings, passages about the water dwellers and the keepers of forgotten places, about how they could grant knowledge and years of life in exchange for service. And there, on the final written page, was my signature. Not once, but many times, in ink that still looked wet. Dates accompanied each signature, going back decades before my birth. The realization hit me with physical force. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing myself over and over again. How many times had I come here? How many times had I forgotten, only to be drawn back? The floor beneath me shifted, stone grinding against stone. The pedestal began to sink into the ground as water seeped into the chamber from invisible sources, quickly rising past my ankles, my knees. I tried to reach the staircase but found it gone. The entrance sealed by a solid wall of stone that hadn't been there moments before. The water continued to rise, now at my chest, bearing that familiar pattern of ripples. Tap, tap, tap. Pause.
Top, 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 top.
Something moved beneath the surface, something massive displacing the rising water. Cold fingers brushed against my legs, then wrapped around my ankles with gentle, insistent pressure. As the water reached my chin, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This had happened before. It would happen again. The water closed over my head, and in the perfect silence of submersion, I heard that voice again, the one from the radio, from my dreams, from the misty face in the cistern. "Welcome home," it said in that ancient language I somehow knew. "It's time to forget again." The darkness of the water turned absolute as my lungs began to burn. I felt my body being pulled deeper, past where the floor should be, into some vast space beneath the foundation of the facility, beneath the mountain itself. My last conscious thought was a memory breaking through the surface, of standing in this same chamber decades ago, watching an old man sign his name in the copper book. His face, turned to me in the lamplight, was my own face, aged beyond recognition but unmistakable. "Next time," he had whispered to me, "run," but I never do.
Top, top, top.
Pause.
Top, 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 top.
The water fills my lungs, and with it comes forgetting. In 27 days, I will wake in a motel room with a job offer to document an abandoned water treatment facility. I will accept, desperate for work after my recent divorce. I will not remember having been there before. And somewhere in the depths beneath Morrison Reservoir, ancient things that were never meant to be disturbed will welcome back their faithful servant, their willing vessel, their collector of the curious and the lost. Me. Always me. Again and again and again. The first time I heard it, I thought it was interference. A strange, pulsing signal bleeding through the earpiece of my handheld radio. 3 rapid chirps followed by a low drone that lasted exactly 7 seconds before repeating. I was deep in the tunnels of the abandoned Blackridge water filtration complex, where the concrete walls should have blocked any outside transmission. I switched frequencies, but the pattern followed, lurking beneath the static. 3 chirps, 7-second drone. 3 chirps, 7-second drone. I switched the radio off. The sound continued in perfect rhythm, now seeming to emanate from the pipes overhead. That was 6 days ago. I haven't slept since. The Blackridge facility had been my obsession for months. A massive underground water purification system built in the 1930s and abandoned in the early 2000s after contamination was discovered in the aquifer it tapped. 3 stories of concrete chambers, treatment pools, and maintenance tunnels stretched beneath an unassuming pump house at the edge of the dried lakebed. The perfect location for my doctoral thesis on the acoustic properties of abandoned industrial spaces. I'd spent weeks securing permits, convincing my university's ethics board that the structural assessment was accurate, that the place was safe enough for a lone researcher. Little did I know that structural integrity would be the least of my concerns. I set up my equipment in what had once been the main control room. Moisture-resistant sleeping bag on a cot in the corner. 5 days' worth of supplies. Recording equipment strategically placed throughout the accessible areas. The air was thick with mineral deposits and the peculiar smell of long-standing water. Not putrid, but ancient, like disturbing something that had been perfectly still for centuries. The first night was uneventful, just the background symphony of dripping water and the occasional groan of settling concrete. I'd always found comfort in these forgotten places, where human ambition had been humbled by time and neglect. I'd mapped the eastern section of the complex, noting the peculiar acoustics of the round filtration chambers, how they seemed to amplify and distort even the smallest sounds. Then, on the second day, I found the door. It wasn't on any of the blueprints I'd studied. A heavy steel hatch set flush with the wall in the deepest level, its will handle oxidized to a diseased green. The metal was cold, colder than the surrounding concrete, cold enough that my fingertips burned when I touched it. I tried the wheel, but it wouldn't budge, probably for the best. I marked it on my map and continued my work. That night, I dreamed of turning that wheel, of it spinning freely under my hands as the metal grew colder and colder until my palms stuck to it like a tongue to winter iron. In the dream, something waited on the other side, something that had been listening to my footsteps. I woke to the sound of water running somewhere deep in the complex. Not the occasional drip I'd grown accustomed to, but a steady flow, as if someone had opened a valve. The digital display on my watch read 3:17 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. The flow led me through a series of increasingly narrow tunnels until I found myself back at the steel door. Water was seeping from beneath it, forming a shallow pool that reflected my light in ripples. I knelt and touched it. The water was warm, almost body temperature, and had a faint metallic tang that clung to my fingers. When I stood, the wheel on the door had turned 45 degrees counterclockwise. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. I hadn't touched it. Couldn't have. The wheel would have required significant force to move after all these years. Yet there it was, partially rotated, water now streaming steadily from the widening gap between door and frame. I retreated to my makeshift camp, heart hammering. I told myself it was pressure building up, some pocket of water that had finally broken through. I almost believed it until I checked my recording equipment the next morning. The audio files from the microphone nearest the door contained voices, whispers beneath the sound of flowing water, too faint to make out words but unmistakably human in cadence. Except when I enhanced the audio, isolating those frequencies, the whispers resolved into a series of numbers, repeated over and over: 317, 3-1-7, 3-1-7, the same digits as the time I'd awakened. I should have left then. Any rational person would have packed up and gone straight to their car. But I'd spent months preparing for this research, and one unexplained recording wasn't enough to abandon everything. I told myself I'd do one more day of work, focusing on the upper levels, away from that door. But as I gathered my equipment, I noticed something on my laptop screen. A file I didn't recognize, named simply 317.wave. I hadn't created it. It wasn't there the night before. I clicked play. It was my own voice, but I had no memory of saying the words. The sediment speaks if you listen closely enough. The frequency of dust. They've been filtering more than water here. The timestamp on the file indicated it had been created at 3:17 a.m. I shut the laptop, hands trembling. Something was very wrong. I decided to retrieve my equipment from the lower levels and leave immediately. As I descended the stairs to the bottom floor, the air became noticeably heavier, charged with an electrical quality that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The lights on my headlamp seemed dimmer, struggling against a darkness that felt almost solid. The microphone I'd placed near the steel door was gone. In its place was a small pile of rust-colored dust, arranged in a perfect circle. I knelt to examine it, and that's when I heard the radio signal for the first time, 3 chirps, 7-second drone, repeating, coming from my handheld radio that I hadn't yet switched on. When I returned to my camp to pack, I found my sleeping bag damp, not with water, but with a viscous, rust-colored fluid that smelled of copper and salt. My laptop screen displayed a single image, a black and white photograph of the Blackridge facility from what appeared to be the 1940s. Workers in period clothing stood in front of the pump house. I didn't recognize the photograph. It wasn't part of my research materials. I looked closer. In the back row, partially obscured by other figures, was a face I recognized with absolute clarity. It was my own. The rational part of my mind insisted it was a look-alike, some distant relative perhaps. But the eyes, they were unmistakably mine, looking out from a photograph taken decades before I was born. I packed frantically, shoving equipment into my bags without care. As I worked, the radio signal grew louder, now seeming to come from the walls themselves. 3 chirps, 7-second drone. I tried covering my ears, but the sound persisted, as if it were inside my head. When I reached the stairs leading up to the exit, I found them subtly changed. The concrete steps, which had been straight before, now curved slightly to the left, spiraling downward rather than up. The exit sign that had been at the top now flickered weakly halfway down. I climbed anyway, desperate to reach the surface, but after 10 minutes of ascent, I emerged not into daylight but into the filtration chamber where I'd found the steel door. The wheel had turned further. The gap was now wide enough to see through. I approached slowly, fighting every instinct screaming at me to run. Through the opening, I could see not another room but what appeared to be an identical corridor to the one I stood in, stretching away into darkness. A mirror image of my reality, but subtly wrong. The pipes ran in different directions, the water flowed upward rather than down, and the air that seeped through was dry and cold and tasted of metal. On the floor just inside was a handheld radio, identical to mine but aged, its plastic yellowed and cracked. It emitted the now familiar signal, 3 chirps, 7-second drone. I reached for it without thinking. As my fingers touched the ancient plastic, the signal stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a whisper from deeper within that mirrored corridor. My own voice, but older, worn down by time or something worse. "I've been waiting for you to find me, to complete the circle." I jerked back, but something held my hand to the radio. Not a physical force, but a terrible synchronicity, as if my body on this side had to mirror actions already completed by that other self. With my free hand, I fumbled for my phone to use as a light, to see further into that impossible space. The screen showed no signal, no time, just a series of numbers cycling endlessly. 317, 3-1-7, 3-1-7, and then the screen changed to the camera view, though I hadn't activated it. It showed me, from behind, standing at the door, but there was something else in the frame, just over my shoulder, emerging from that other corridor. A figure composed of what looked like rust-colored dust, swirling and reforming continuously. It had no face, just a smooth oval where features should be, and as I watched through the screen, it reached out a hand toward the back of my neck. I felt the touch, cold, gritty fingers on my skin, though when I spun around, there was nothing there. But in the phone screen, the dust figure remained, now directly before me, its featureless face inches from mine. The radio crackled to life again, but now the message was clear. "You've been coming here for so long, every 37 years. Don't you remember yet?" Memories that weren't mine flooded my consciousness. Working at the facility in 1943, discovering something in the water that shouldn't have been there, something microscopic that altered perception, that folded time back on itself. I remembered sealing it away behind a steel door, remembered failing, remembered returning again and again across decades that hadn't happened yet. I staggered back, dropping both radio and phone. The dust figure in the camera view reached toward me, arms stretching impossibly. I ran, no longer caring which direction led out, just needing to put distance between myself and that door. I found myself in an unfamiliar section of the complex. The walls here were older, made of fitted stone rather than poured concrete, inscribed with symbols that predated the facility by centuries. I recognized them from research I hadn't yet conducted, books I hadn't read. This part of the complex shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet I navigated it with the confidence of someone who had walked these passages many times before. At the end of the stone corridor was a chamber with a pool at its center. The water was perfectly still, black as oil, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Hanging from the ceiling above it was an elaborate mechanical device that resembled an astronomical clock, its gears frozen with rust and time. I knew, without understanding how, that this was the heart of it all, the true filtration system, designed not for water but for something else. Something that flowed through reality like sediment, collecting in forgotten places. The surface of the pool shimmered. A hand emerged. My hand, aged and withered, reaching upward. Then an arm, a shoulder, until my own face broke the surface, 50 years older at least. Eyes clouded with cataracts but unmistakably mine. "You have to complete it," my older self said, voice like gravel. "Break the cycle. The calculation is wrong. Not 317. The 713. Reverse the frequency." Before I could respond, the figure sank back beneath the surface, leaving nothing but ripples that moved inward rather than outward, collapsing toward a central point until the pool was still once more. I fumbled for my handheld radio, somehow knowing what I needed to do. The display panel, which showed the broadcast frequency, was stuck at 31.7 megahertz. With trembling fingers, I reversed it to 71.3 megahertz and pressed transmit. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The walls around me began to vibrate, dust and small pieces of debris floating upward against gravity. The radio grew hot in my hand, the plastic melting around my fingers, fusing to my skin. I screamed but couldn't hear my own voice over the sudden roar that filled the chamber. The sound of rushing water, but played backward, a torrential flow reversing itself. The ceiling collapsed, not down toward me, but upward, stone and concrete pulling away to reveal not the ground above but a night sky I didn't recognize. Stars arranged in constellations that shouldn't exist wheeled overhead, and beneath them, suspended in midair, was the Blackridge facility. Not as ruins, but intact, new, under construction, being dismantled all simultaneously. I saw myself at different ages, working in the facility across decades that bled into one another. I watched myself discover the truth over and over, try to warn others, fail, return, forget, begin again. An endless loop of discovery and loss, all centered around what lay behind that steel door. Reality fractured around me. I fell through versions of my life that hadn't happened, memories crystallizing and dissolving. In one, I was the engineer who designed the facility. In another, I was the worker who first noticed the contamination. In yet another, I was something else entirely, something that had worn my face like a mask, using my research to find its way back. When I came back to myself, I was standing in the main control room where I'd set up camp. My equipment was gone, my supplies untouched. The concrete floor was covered in a thin layer of rust-colored dust that swirled in patterns too regular to be formed by air currents. The dust moved with purpose, gathering itself into a humanoid shape that stood watching me. Though it had no eyes, I felt its attention like a physical weight. It raised a hand, pointing toward the depths of the facility. I understood then. It wanted me to open the door completely, to let whatever waited on the other side fully into this world. It had been patient, working slowly across time, using the water, the dust, the peculiar acoustics of this place to thin the boundaries. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen showed a text message from a number composed entirely of 3s, 1s, and 7s. Almost time to meet yourself again. Below it was an image, the steel door, fully open, darkness beyond. That was 3 days ago. I've tried to leave the facility 17 times since then. Each attempt leads me back to the control room, where the dust figure waits, growing more solid with each failure. I've tried destroying my phone, the radio, but they reappear, switched on, broadcasting that signal that now seems to resonate with my own heartbeat. 3 chirps, 7-second drone, like a countdown. The dust has begun to cover my skin while I sleep during my brief moments of unconsciousness, working its way into my pores. I wake with my mouth full of it, the taste of rust and ancient water on my tongue. Each time I'm a little less substantial, a little more like the figure that watches me. Last night, I found a journal hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. The handwriting is mine, but the entries span back to 1943, continuing to the present day. The final entry, dated tomorrow, is blank except for a single line. The door is fully open now. I am what comes through. I hear footsteps in the corridor outside the control room. They match my gait perfectly, but they approach when I am sitting still. The doorknob is turning. The dust swirls eagerly toward the opening door. I think at last I am about to meet myself. The first time I heard the sound, I was checking water quality readings at the bottom level of the abandoned filtration chamber. A hollow, metallic ping, like a single droplet hitting the surface of still water, but impossibly amplified. Then silence. 20 seconds passed before it came again. Ping. The acoustics in the cavernous underground reservoir distorted sound in strange ways, but this wasn't the normal settling of the century-old structure. Ping. Exactly 20 seconds apart. Too precise to be natural. I killed my flashlight and waited in the pitch darkness. The water department had sent me alone to this decommissioned treatment facility to collect final environmental samples before demolition began next month. The massive underground complex had been built in 1908, a cathedral of concrete and rusted pipes 40 feet beneath the surface of Lake Absalom. A marvel of engineering for its time, now a forgotten relic accessible only by a single maintenance boat and a series of precarious metal ladders. Ping. The sound came again, but this time from directly behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and swept my flashlight beam across the arched chamber. My light caught something, a ripple of movement across the surface of the black water, but nothing solid. The circular filtration pool stretched 20 yards across, surrounded by crumbling concrete walkways. Nobody else could be down here. I'd locked the only access door behind me when I descended. My watch read 4:17 p.m. I still had samples to collect from the eastern tunnel, but suddenly the thought of venturing deeper into the facility's labyrinthine passages sent cold sweat trickling down my spine. 6 more samples, then I could retreat to my tent on the shoreline 2 miles away. The flashlight flickered, dimmed, and then blazed with unnatural brightness. I smacked it against my palm, and it returned to normal. Battery issue, I told myself. Nothing more. Ping. This time, the sound wasn't a ping but a prolonged metallic groan, like massive pressure building in ancient pipes. I shivered despite the humid air. My doctoral thesis advisor had assured me this would be straightforward fieldwork, perfect for a graduate student in environmental engineering with experience in confined spaces. What he hadn't mentioned was how the emptiness would press against your ears, how the stale air would taste of mineral deposits, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something ancient, something patient. I moved to the edge of the filtration pool, crouching to collect my sample. The water was perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting nothing. My sample kit showed contaminant levels far higher than expected. Heavy metals, chemicals that shouldn't be present. I recorded the readings in my notebook with trembling hands. When I stood, I noticed it. A perfect circle of small stones arranged on the walkway 10 feet ahead. They hadn't been there moments before. I was certain. 12 smooth river rocks placed with mathematical precision. I approached slowly, playing my light over the formation. The stones were wet, dripping onto the concrete. I hadn't brought stones with me. There were none like this in the reservoir. Hello! My voice echoed, distorted by the curved ceiling. Is someone down here? Only the hollow space answered, returning my words as a whisper. I photographed the stone circle, then continued toward the eastern tunnel, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The main chamber narrowed into a service corridor lined with rusted valves and broken gauges. My breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber filled with massive filtration tanks. The municipal records had indicated this section was partially flooded, but as my light swept across the room, I saw that the tanks were completely dry. Their iron lids had been removed and placed with impossible neatness beside each tank. 7 tanks, 7 lids, all perfectly aligned. This isn't happening, I whispered. My words fell flat, as if the air itself had thickened. A crackling sound broke the silence, the static of my handheld radio suddenly coming to life. I tried using it earlier to contact my research supervisor, but the signal couldn't penetrate the concrete and earth above. Now it hissed with static, then cleared. Found the old blueprints, Emma. A voice emerged from the white noise, fading in and out. The reservoir construction, 19 workers died. Accident covered up. It was Dr. Lowell's voice, but I hadn't activated the radio. Sealed chamber beneath the filtration level. Remains never recovered. The transmission dissolved into static, then silence. My fingers fumbled with the device, pressing the talk button repeatedly. Dr. Lowell? Are you there? How are you transmitting down here? No response. Only dead air. I checked my cell phone. No signal as expected. No way to verify if Lowell had actually tried to contact me or if... No, there had to be a rational explanation. Sound traveling through ventilation shafts. Old mining tunnels connecting to the surface. Someone playing an elaborate prank. I collected the remaining samples quickly, trying to ignore how the temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in the last half hour. My breath now fogged in front of my face. Mid-August, and I could see my breath underground. When I turned to leave, I froze. The way back to the main chamber was blocked, not by debris or a collapsed passage, but by a wall of perfectly clear water suspended in the archway. It hung there, defying gravity, gently rippling like a vertical pool. Through its wavering surface, I could see the corridor beyond, distorted but passable. I approached it cautiously, extending my hand. The suspended water parted around my fingers, cold but not freezing. Nothing but an elaborate optical illusion, I told myself, stepping through the impossible curtain. My clothes remained perfectly dry. Back in the main chamber, I noticed the stone circle had changed. Now the 12 stones formed a humanoid shape with outstretched arms. I felt dizzy, gripping the rusted railing for support. My watch read 5:43 p.m. Nearly an hour and a half had passed, but it had felt like 20 minutes at most. Something skittered across the ceiling above, a sound like fingernails dragging across concrete. I raised my light but saw only crumbling plaster and decades of mineral deposits. I needed to leave. Now, the ascent ladder loomed ahead across the main pool. I hurried forward, samples secure in my backpack. 3 steps onto the metal catwalk, and I heard it. A voice emanating from the black water. Emma. Just my name, spoken softly. The voice was familiar yet wrong, as if someone were attempting to mimic human speech with machinery. I looked down. The water's surface rippled, forming patterns that momentarily resembled a human face. My face. Then it spoke again. Do you remember drowning, Emma? My knees weakened. I've never drowned, I whispered. Not in this life, replied the water. The flashlight died. Complete darkness enveloped me. I fumbled for my backup light, fingers clumsy with panic. When the new beam cut through the blackness, I was no longer alone on the catwalk. A figure stood at the far end, humanoid but wrong. His proportions were slightly distorted, too tall, limbs too long. It appeared to be composed entirely of water, its transparent form catching the light like polished glass. It had no face, just a smooth oval where features should be. I backed away, my heel catching on an uneven section of the walkway. The water figure took a step forward, its movement producing that now familiar sound. Ping. Who are you? I demanded, voice cracking. The figure tilted its featureless head. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. We are what remains. Its liquid form rippled. 19 souls, drowned when they flooded the lower chamber without warning. Our bodies never recovered. I thought of Dr. Lowell's broken radio message, the construction accident, the covered-up deaths. What do you want from me? The figure took another step closer. Recognition. Another step. Remembrance. A final step now only yards away. Return. My back pressed against the railing. I don't understand. You were the 20th Emma Winters. The name hit me like a physical blow. Winters wasn't my surname. It was Chun. I'd never gone by any other name. But something ancient and buried stirred in my mind, like sediment disturbed after decades of stillness. You're confused, I said. My name is Emma Chun. 1908. You were the engineer's daughter. You discovered your father's role in the decision to flood the chamber with workers still inside. You came here to gather evidence. The water figure's surface rippled more violently now. They found you, silenced you. Your body rests with ours 100 feet below. That's not possible. But even as I denied it, fragmented images flooded my mind. Blueprints spread across a wooden table, angry voices behind closed doors, a leather-bound journal clutched in small hands. A steep descent into darkness. The figure extended a liquid arm toward me. You've returned every 20 years since. Different face, different name, same soul, same fate. My flashlight flickered wildly, illuminating the chamber in strobing bursts. In those flashes, I saw that the main pool was no longer empty. Figures stood within it, water people, dozens of them, all looking up at me with their featureless faces. This isn't real, I whispered, but my conviction was weakening. I'm a graduate student. I was born in 1998. My parents are alive. I have memories. Implanted, said the figure. Borrowed. Stolen from lives you never lived. I clutched my head, suddenly overwhelmed by dual memories. My childhood home in Seattle, but also a Victorian house overlooking a construction site. My mother's smile as she packed my lunch for school, but also a stern woman in period clothing warning me not to interfere in my father's business. Every 20 years, the figure continued, you are drawn back, you investigate, you remember, and then what? I whispered. You join us again. The catwalk shuddered beneath me. Metal groaned against metal. The entire structure was vibrating, resonating with the same frequency as the ping I'd heard earlier. I ran. Blind panic propelled me toward the exit ladder. The water figures made no move to stop me, watching impassively as I scrambled onto the first rung. Their stillness was somehow more terrifying than pursuit. The ladder seemed longer than before, each rung slippery with moisture. Halfway up, a deafening crack echoed through the chamber. I looked down to see the catwalk collapsing, plunging into the dark water. The liquid figures remained standing on the surface, heads tilted upward, watching me climb. 10 rungs from the top, my hand closed around something soft instead of metal. I jerked away instinctively, nearly losing my balance. My flashlight revealed a decomposed human hand, the flesh gray and waterlogged, protruding from between the ladder rungs. As I watched in horror, more appendages emerged from inside the hollow ladder. Hands, forearms, even a partial face pressing against the metal from within. I scrambled past them, hyperventilating. The access hatch waited above, my only escape. I pushed against it with desperate strength, feeling it give way. Fresh air rushed in as I hauled myself onto the small platform above the reservoir. Night had fallen. The dock where I'd moored my boat was illuminated by pale moonlight. I slammed the hatch shut, securing the heavy iron lock with trembling hands. Standing on shaking legs, I pulled out my phone. 5 bars of signal. I dialed Dr. Lowell immediately. Emma, he answered. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Something happened down there, I gasped. I'm coming back now. There's something wrong with that place. Wait, what? Slow down. What happened? Did you try to radio me about an accident? About workers who died during construction? A pause. No, I haven't tried to contact you at all today. The radio wouldn't work at that depth anyway. My blood turned to ice. I need to check something. I'll call you back. I ended the call and opened my photos, scrolling to where I'd photographed the stone circle. The image showed only an empty stretch of concrete. I checked the next photo, the filtration tanks. In the image, the tanks were partially submerged, their lids scattered haphazardly. Nothing like the neatly arranged scene I'd encountered. With growing dread, I opened my sample kit. The vials were filled not with water but with thick, black mud. I dropped the kit in shock, vials shattering on the platform. The boat waited, tied to the small wooden dock extending into the lake. 20 yards of dark water separated me from escape. I approached the dock carefully, flashlight beam cutting through the mist that had begun to rise from the lake's surface. The wooden planks creaked under my weight. 3 steps out, I noticed the water around the dock was moving strangely, not with waves or current, but swirling in deliberate patterns. The swirls expanded, connecting, forming what looked like enormous handprints pressing up from below. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it into the lake. Dr. Lowell's name flashed on the screen. "Hello," I answered, voice barely audible. "Emma, I checked the historical records," he said urgently. "You were right about the accident. 19 workers died when they flooded the lower chamber prematurely in 1908. But there's something else. A 20th victim was found weeks later. The chief engineer's daughter, Emma Winters, age 25. They ruled it suicide, but there were rumors that she was silenced." I finished numbly. "Yes. How did you know that?" I didn't answer. The mist had thickened around me, forming tendrils that reached toward my ankles. The boat suddenly seemed impossibly far away. "Emma, are you there?" Lowell's voice crackled through the phone. "What year was the reservoir decommissioned?" I asked. 1994. They found contamination. Heavy metals, industrial chemicals that shouldn't have been present. But the strangest thing was, "Let me guess," I interrupted. "They found human remains." Silence on the other end. Then, yes, bone fragments in the filtration system. They were never identified. The mist had become a solid wall around the dock, cutting off my view of the shore. Only the boat remained visible, gently rocking in water that had gone completely still. "Dr. Lowell," I said carefully, "what was the date they found those remains?" "August 17th, 1994. Today's date. Exactly 20 years ago." "I need to ask you something important," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "What's my full name?" "What? Emma, are you feeling all right?" "My name, please." "Emma Chin. You know that. And my parents? Where do they live?" "Seattle. You've mentioned them often enough." Concern filled his voice. "Emma, what's going on?" Relief washed over me. The water entities had been lying. I was Emma Chin, graduate student. I had a life, a history, a future. "One more question," I said. "When did I join the research program?" 2 weeks ago, he replied without hesitation. "You transferred from MIT. We've never actually met in person. This sample collection was supposed to be our first face-to-face next week when you returned." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden dock. 2 weeks ago. But I had memories of meetings with Lowell, of classes I'd taken with him, of a year spent in his program. Implanted memories. Borrowed. Stolen. I looked down at my hands. In the moonlight, they appeared normal. But when I held them up to my flashlight, I could see through them. Just slightly, just enough to notice the wood grain of the dock visible through my pale skin. The lake erupted. Water figures burst from the surface. Dozens of them, their faceless heads turned toward me. They rose until they stood upon the water, a silent congregation. At their center emerged one different from the others, a female form whose watery surface rippled to reveal features. "My features. Every 20 years, the figure said with my voice. "The cycle repeats. A new Emma arrives, investigating the reservoir one final time." I backed away until I reached the platform's edge. "I'm real," I insisted. "I have a life, parents, memories." "You have what we gave you," said my double. "A temporary vessel, a borrowed identity." It gestured to the others. "We've been waiting for you to remember."
Tout rejoint US.
The mist swirled around my legs, solidifying into hands that grasped my ankles. I struggled, but their grip was implacable. "What happens now?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Now, we return below, all of us, until the next cycle." The hands pulled. I fell to my knees on the dock, fingernails splintering as I clawed at the wood. The lake's black surface parted beneath me, revealing not water, but a vertical tunnel descending into absolute darkness. My flashlight illuminated a metal ladder identical to the one I'd climbed earlier, but this one extended downward, far beyond where the reservoir should end. And emerging from between its rungs were dozens of decomposed hands, reaching upward. As the mist hands dragged me toward the opening, I saw something floating on the water's surface. My sample kit, intact and sealed, not shattered as I'd thought. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal I didn't recognize. My name was embossed on its cover. Emma Winters, 1908. The last thing I saw before the water closed over my head was the moon reflected on the lake's surface, perfect and white against the black sky. Ping. The sound follows me into the depths, a metronomic reminder. 20 years. I'll wait 20 years in the darkness with the others, 19 workers, and all the Emmas who came before. Then I'll rise again, wearing a new face but carrying the same soul, drawn back to uncover a truth I've discovered countless times before. I wonder what name I'll have next time. I wonder if I'll remember drowning. Ping. 20 seconds. 20 years. The cycle continues.